Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome back to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking under city lights, curled beneath blankets as rain taps the windows, or simply searching for stillness in a noisy day, this space is for you. Because tonight, we journey into one of the strangest silences in human history. Why our ancestors remained naked for nearly 90,000 years before ever thinking to dress. This is contemplative science, and ancient storytelling, woven for thoughtful minds. It's an untold story about the human body, a 90,000-year pause in our evolution, and the searing sun that wrote secrets into our skin. But it begins not with a thread, but with a choice. Not the invention of clothing, but the long decision to stay exposed. Oh, and if you're the kind of mind who seeks quiet, detailed journeys into human history, you can look just below this video. The button says subscribe. Go ahead and tap it. You can unsubscribe anytime. There's a bell next to it too. Press that, and you'll be gently notified when the next journey arrives. Subscribing truly helps this channel survive. Without it, these kinds of stories disappear. If these stories bring you calm, you can tap the super thanks under this video. It truly helps keep these prehistoric journeys alive. Also, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? If you feel like sharing, the comments are open. It reminds us we're not alone in this quiet. And, if your eyes start to close, feel free. There are chapter timestamps in the description if you want to return later. Now let's begin with a body left bare beneath the stars. For nearly 100,000 years the human body remained exposed, naked against the wind, the rain, the burning sun. We, the species that would one day clothe the world in silk and armour and ceremony, once walked the earth bare-skinned and silent, with no stitching to shield us. It is not a minor curiosity. It is one of the most profound paradoxes in our evolutionary story, because we were not born into paradise. We stood upright in scorching heat and freezing dusk, in open plains and shifting dust surrounded by predators, yet we wore nothing but skin. Why? Why would a creature with such fragile flesh, such a capacity for foresight and invention, remain unclothed for so long? What held us back, or held us in place? Clothing as we know it now is not merely protection, it is invention, it is language, it is hierarchy and ritual and shame and adornment. And yet, long after we carved tools and painted with ochre, long after fire was tamed and language was rising, the body remained bare. No woven tunics, no stitched seams, no belts, no cloaks, no thread. Anthropologists trace the origin of tailored clothing to somewhere around 30 to 40,000 years ago, but anatomically modern humans had walked the earth for at least 100,000 before that, possibly more. That chasm between ability and action, that silent hesitation, is where the mystery lies. Why did we wait? Perhaps the better question is, what did it feel like to be so exposed to the world? Not in metaphor, but in the most literal sense. To stand without insulation beneath the night sky, ribs rising and falling with each breath, with nothing to mediate the cold or the gaze of others. To move as both animal and anomaly. No fur, no feathers, no scaled hide. Just skin. Skin that flushes and scars. Skin that burns. Skin that touches and remembers. Skin that reveals. In our distant cousins, the primates who still swing beneath canopy shade, fur is not a costume, it is continuity. It is warmth and display and camouflage all at once. Chimpanzees are thick-coated, their bodies wrapped in evolutionary layers that speak of safety and selection. Gorillas shimmer with dense black hair, a signal of power and age. Even our extinct ancestors, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, perhaps even early Homo erectus, likely carried some form of bodily covering bestowed by nature itself. But we, somewhere along the arc of our evolution, shed it. And not by accident. Not entirely. The human body did not lose its fur the way one loses a trait by neglect. It was peeled away by pressure, slow, relentless pressure, from sun and stride and survival. There is no accident in the way our sweat glands stretch across our surface like a living irrigation map. There is no mistake in the colour changes of our skin, from the rich eumelanin of equatorial lineages to the paler tones adapted for northern skies. Hair was sacrificed for heat loss, for cooling, for endurance. We did not lose fur because we were weak. We lost it because we were becoming something else. We became the runners. We became the creatures that could outlast antelopes and exhaust lions. that could chase and chase beneath the crushing sun without breaking. And in that pursuit, in that dust-bound, heat-glazed trial, fur became a liability. Hair holds heat, sweat cools. The bare skin of Homo sapiens was not a vulnerability then. It was an advantage, a razor's edge that carved through savanna and time, but even advantage demands cost. If we became heat-adapted, stripped-down bodies for the sake of survival, what did we lose in return? What happens when the storm hits, when the shadows fall, when the wind bites harder than the sun ever burned? What happens when the world turns cold and we remain naked? In the fossil silence of prehistory there are no whispered regrets, no skeletal shame. But the clues are there, in hair follicles that no longer bristle, in the microscopic remnants of lice that once lived only in clothing, in the cracked hands of ancient tools that speak not of luxury, but of necessity. We see a species balanced on the edge between adaptation and anticipation. The loss of fur was not the invention of clothing. One does not follow immediately from the other. Between those two moments lies a long stretch of time, tens of thousands of years, where the body had no covering but firelight and the touch of other skin. How did they endure it? The nights on the open steppe, the winds that curled around the ribs like fingers. Did they huddle in caves, stacked together like coals, human warmth substituted for wool? Did they smear mud, wrap bark, sleep beneath leaves, or did they simply bear it? Silent and still, teeth clattering softly as they waited for the light. No myths, no weaving, no memory yet inscribed in symbol, just the breath, the hunger, the ache. This is not the story of a sudden failure. It is the story of a species caught between two great forces, biology and imagination. Our biology had pushed us forward, shaved us down, sculpted us into long-distance survivors, but imagination had not yet clothed us. That bridge, from what the body endures to what the mind invents, would take time to cross. And in that time, the skin was everything. It was not merely the boundary between self and world. It was the world. It was landscape and canvas, mirror and map. It told others if we were cold, aroused, diseased, injured, ashamed. It marked the passage of sun with burns and freckles, bore the signature of wounds both recent and ancient. The naked human was not neutral. The naked human was expressive. Unlike furred animals, we had no barrier to conceal the tremble of fear, the flush of anger, the vulnerability of injury. What could be read in our skin was no longer hidden, and perhaps that changed everything. What if our nakedness made us more visible, not just to predators, but to one another? What if the human body, stripped of nature's armour, became the first language we ever spoke? There is no archaeological tool fine enough to measure vulnerability, yet it shaped us as surely as stone shaped the hand axe. Vulnerability is not merely weakness, it is awareness, it is exposure, it is a mirror of care. And in those ancient days, before the stitch, before the seam, vulnerability may have been the strongest thread we had. But what kind of courage does it take? To walk through ice-crusted wind with nothing to shield the body but the memory of heat? What story does the skin tell when the world turns against it? It tells of defiance, of a species that stood not in shelter, but in the open, a creature that did not hide, but endured. The sun left its mark, and still we walked. The frost cracked the surface, and still we moved. We bled and burned and blistered, but we did not yet cover. And what does that say about who we were, not just as animals, but as emerging minds? For to be naked is not only to be unprotected, it is to be seen, fully, unfiltered, and that condition, though ancient, touches something present in us still. Beneath all our textiles and technology, beneath the layered symbols of clothing and culture, there is an ancient self that once stood in silence beneath the stars, with skin bared to the cosmos. That memory is not written in books. It is not recorded in pigment or text. It is remembered in the cells, in the goosebumps that rise in cold or awe, in the way shame flushes the cheeks, in the comfort of sunlight on bare shoulders. The skin remembers. And yet we must ask, why did it take so long to forget? To forget the cold, to forget the exposure, to forget even briefly that we were vulnerable? The answers lie not in a single moment, but in a constellation of delayed inventions. We crafted tools, exquisite ones, out of stone and bone. We mastered fire, built shelters, hunted across plains. But clothing, true clothing, the kind that is shaped, sized, fitted and tied, took time. Too much time. Anthropologists tell us that tailored garments requiring needles and precise cuts likely appeared only within the last 40,000 years. But the cognitive capacity for such innovation had been brewing long before, so why did we wait? The paradox is not just technological, it is philosophical. We had the hands, we had the minds, but we may not yet have had the need, or perhaps more hauntingly we had not yet admitted the need. What if the hardest part was not invention, but concession? To clothe oneself is to admit the body must be hidden, must be protected, must be different from the world around it. It is to declare the skin insufficient. Was that a truth too bitter to taste? Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of a deeper transformation, not from animal to human, but from exposure to identity. Because clothing is not neutral. Even in its earliest ragged forms, it is decision. It is choice. It is metaphor, made material. And long before we chose to weave, we chose to wait. We chose to live, vulnerable, in the open air, speaking first not with words or coverings, but with skin. Skin that bore our first truth to the world. I am here. I am alive. And I feel everything. And what does it mean to feel everything when nothing shields you from the world's touch? The earliest humans, our ancestors, lived each moment in the fullness of sensation. The sun did not press through fabric, it kissed the raw body directly. Rain did not patter against a coat, it slid down the spine cool and alerting. Wind was not dulled by layers. It howled across the ribs, slipped between the fingers, made the skin a landscape of tremors and tension. In nakedness we were weathered, but not broken. We were exposed, but not yet ashamed. But exposure is not just physical, it is emotional, social. And in the absence of clothing, the human form stood fully revealed, not only to the elements, but to each other. What could be read in the curve of a shoulder, the shiver of skin, the subtle reflex of recoil or welcome? The body became a mirror. Without cloth it could not lie. Without costumes it could not pretend. There was no mask to hide behind, no fabric to signal status, allegiance, or modesty. What remained was truth, a soft, breathing, bruisable truth. And perhaps that, more than any storm or cold night, was the deeper trial. How do you live in constant exposure, not only to harm but to being known? To be human is to know this paradox intimately. We crave connection, yet we fear being seen too clearly. We long to belong, yet hide behind layers of fabric, of language, of story. But the earliest humans had none of those veils. Their interactions were immediate. Their bodies were readable. Vulnerability was not a performance, it was the default. And that condition may have forged a kind of empathy, a quiet communion between skins, between eyes that saw the same wounds mirrored in each other. It is no coincidence that touch remains one of our most ancient forms of care. Before there were clothes, there were hands. Before there was shelter, there was warmth offered through closeness. In the face of night and cold, the solution was not to shield the self, but to share the body. Warmth as offering, skin as bridge. These were not mere instincts, they were acts of meaning. So when we ask why it took so long to clothe ourselves, perhaps we must also ask what we were not yet ready to give up. What did nakedness offer us that garments could not? What kind of knowledge is lost the moment we cover ourselves? Perhaps it is the knowledge of immediate presence, the intimacy of being seen without intention. Once fabric intervenes, we choose what is visible. We begin to curate. With clothing, we not only protect the body, we begin to perform the self. This is not a flaw. It is a deepening of identity. But it is a departure from the elemental state of being known, simply by being there. The clothed body offers symbols, the naked body offers signals. One requires interpretation, the other only attention. Yet in that primal transparency there is risk. A body without cover is a body that cannot hide its fear, its hunger, its fragility. And perhaps in time, that visibility became too costly. As human groups grew, as roles solidified, as the first shadows of status and exclusion crept across the social landscape, the need for concealment arose, not only from cold, but from each other. To be naked was to be equal. To be clothed was to begin the story of distinction. And so the transformation began, slowly, fitfully, not in a single spark, but in a scattered rhythm across tens of millennia. Skins wrapped around shoulders, fibres twisted into bands, symbol and function merged. But the memory remained. In dreams, we are still often naked. In rituals, we disrobe to mark transition. In moments of vulnerability, we say we feel exposed, as if our ancestors whisper still through the layers we wear. The human story is not one of simple progress. It is a winding braid of loss and invention, of forgetting and remembering. For 90,000 years we walked the earth unclothed yet deeply alive, more exposed perhaps, but no less complete. The skin bore our stories before the needle did. The wind was our first garment, the sun our oldest witness. There is something sacred in that simplicity. To feel heat and cold without buffer, to know the seasons not by the calendar, but by the breath of the air against your chest. To live in such directness is to belong to the world in a way we may have since forgotten. The moment we wrapped our bodies, we began to step away from the immediacy of sensation and toward abstraction. Protection became priority, but with it came a quiet farewell to the wildness of being truly known, not by others, but by the elements themselves. And as we look back across that vast silence of time, one question remains suspended in the air, not as a riddle, but as an invitation. What does it mean that we stayed naked for so long, when we had the means not to? And what part of us, even now, still longs to return to that ancient nakedness? Not of body alone, but of presence, of honesty, of being seen without fear, because there was a time, a long and shimmering time, when the human body was not covered and not questioned. A time when our skin, exposed to the world, did not merely endure its forces, it recorded them. A parchment of flesh, written upon by wind, marked by sun, cooled by breath. The loss of fur was not the end of protection, it was the beginning of a strange new language, one spoken without words, but full of meaning. We did not simply become hairless, we became luminous. Our skin, freed from the dark curtain of fur, began to glow with effort, with emotion, with blood. We became thermally visible. The body's circulatory map was no longer hidden beneath a pelt, it was drawn across the surface. Blush and pallor, flush and fever, sweat and shiver. The body began to communicate through temperature and colour, through movement, through exposure. But why lose the fur at all? The answer, etched into the trails of long-dead footprints across ancient savanna, lies in motion. Human ancestors became runners, not the quick, lunging predators of the feline world, but slow, tireless shadows that chased prey not by speed, but by persistence. Endurance hunting, a test not of aggression, but of patience. And in this ritual of attrition, heat was the great opponent. Those who could cool themselves as they ran, who could pant not through the mouth but through every pore, gained the advantage. And so we shed. Hair traps heat. Sweat releases it. We became slick with evaporation. Our bodies turned into radiators, shaped not just by what we caught, but how long we could continue moving to catch it. The loss of fur, once protection, became liberation. The savanna sun was brutal, yes, but it was predictable. And in that predictability, evolution carved a solution that was radical, beautiful and bold, bare skin, with millions of tiny portals to carry the heat away. But something else happened. In the absence of fur, the skin began to tell stories. The temperature of blood, the quickness of breath, the swelling of muscles beneath thin layers of skin, these became signals, social cues, emotional confessions. The body, once veiled, had become a stage, and with every step we ran, every encounter we faced, it was sending messages, not just to the environment, but to each other. What happens when biology begins to blur into expression? You begin to wear your emotions, not metaphorically, but literally. The human face, that intricate theatre of muscle and micro-movement, became the most expressive surface in the animal kingdom. It didn't evolve in isolation. It emerged in partnership with the naked skin around it. The fur-covered face of a chimpanzee can snarl, squint, grin. But the furless face of a human blushes with embarrassment, pales with fear, reddens with heat or rage or love. Our skin does not just contain our feelings, it leaks them, and the rest of the body followed suit. The chest swells with pride, the shoulders fold with shame, arms open in welcome or cross in retreat. Fingers tremble with anticipation, or pause mid-air in grief. When you strip away the fur, what remains is not only more visible, it is more readable. Skin becomes grammar. The human body becomes a syntax of emotion. This may not have been a conscious development. It rarely is. But the evolutionary pressures that shaped our bodies also shaped our social tools. A species that lives in groups, that relies not on claws or canines but on collaboration, must be able to signal intent, quickly, reliably, often without sound. In the pre-linguistic world, where vocal cords had not yet become poetry, it was the body that spoke, and it spoke through skin. Attraction began to sculpt this story as well. The exposed human form became a site of selection, not just for survival traits, but for beauty, symmetry, glow. Healthy skin signaled reproductive fitness. Smoothness meant youth. Scars meant survival. Melanin patterns, muscle tone, even the way light played across collarbones, all of it became information. We read each other without knowing we were reading, and in doing so, we began to shape what we became. Could it be that we fell in love before we had words for it, guided only by the flicker of sunlight on naked flesh, by the dilation of pupils, by the warmth of skin that welcomed touch? The body was no longer just a vehicle. It was becoming a message, not a static one, not a carved inscription, but a living, shifting signal system, constantly updated by breath, temperature, motion. A face could become a plea, a gesture could become a poem, and all of it was grounded not in language but in the biology of bare skin. What else did we begin to communicate once our bodies learned to speak? We began to speak of belonging, of danger, of rhythm and play. And over time, the body, once a solitary interface between self and nature, became a bridge between self and others. When we lost our fur, we did not just gain thermoregulation, we gained visibility. And with it came a kind of mutual awareness that would define our species forever. Because skin is not only a surface, it is a threshold. It senses the outside world, pressure, temperature, pain, and sends that information inward. But it also broadcasts the internal world outward. What you feel inside, the skin echoes. There is a tremble when we are anxious, a heat when we are angry, a glow when we are in love. What kind of mirror is this that shows not just the form but the feeling? This dual function of sensing and being sensed makes skin one of the most profound instruments of social life. When a child cries and is held, the warmth of the caregiver's skin does not merely soothe through contact. It signals safety. It says, without words, that you are not alone. The earliest comfort, long before language, was warmth. The earliest intimacy, long before ritual, was touch. The skin, in this light, is both map and memory. It remembers what hurt. It remembers what soothed. It remembers not with words, but with reaction. A flinch where the pain once was, a sigh where the safety once lived. And in groups, these signals become systems. They ripple through communities. A shared gesture becomes custom. A repeated reaction becomes norm. Before laws, before myth, before language carved meaning into sound, the body taught us how to be together. This is why so many rituals even now remain tied to the skin. The paint of warriors, the blush of brides, the anointing of oil, the shaving of heads in mourning, the tattoos of memory and mark. These are not ornamental. They are echoes. They are ways we continue to use skin as a canvas, not for survival, but for story. And beneath all this, biology continues its quiet work. The skin produces pheromones. It reacts to proximity. It senses vibration. It responds to the presence of others in ways we barely understand. We speak of chemistry between people, but what is chemistry if not skin listening to skin? How do you write a story on a surface that is alive, that breathes, that never stops changing? And what happens when that story becomes the self? You create identity from exposure. You build meaning through sensation. You turn biology into biography. Because skin, this thin, vulnerable membrane between blood and world, is not passive. It is responsive. It adapts. It remembers light and friction, repetition and affection. It becomes different things in different places, not only on the body, but in time, in culture, in context. And this adaptability makes it the perfect medium for something new to emerge, the self, as both a private experience and a public interface. The naked human body, once stripped of fur, became not just expressive, but symbolic. And symbols, once born, do not stay still. They spread, they replicate, they evolve. The skin became the space where biology and culture began to negotiate their earliest treaties. Before cities or scripts, before laws or liturgies, there was this question: how do I show you who I am, when I have no tools, no words, no art? The answer was already written. The answer was skin. Consider the earliest evidence we have of intentional human self-marking: ochre staining the bones of the dead, pigment smoothed onto faces, hands pressed in red dust against cave walls. These were not decorations for vanity. They were declarations. The body was the canvas because there was nowhere else to paint, and even if there had been, what else could carry meaning so close to the breath? In this way, the skin became a portable display of selfhood, and with it came the earliest politics of visibility: to show or to hide, to adorn or to remain unmarked, to touch or to forbid touch. These decisions shaped how humans began to organize, not in terms of territory, but in terms of proximity. Who can stand close? Who must stay distant? Whose skin is familiar and whose is foreign? In every era, skin has continued to function not just as tissue, but as boundary, not just as organism, but as metaphor. The idea of having thick skin, of getting under the skin, of being comfortable in one's own skin. These phrases did not arise from abstraction. They were born from experience, ancient, sensory, bodily experience, passed down through feeling, not formula. And if skin became a social interface, then the human body, once an individual vessel of breath and motion, was transformed into a cultural artifact in motion, a walking expression, a sentient sign. What changes in a species when the body ceases to be just a container for life, and becomes instead its most visible argument? You begin to live your truths before you can speak them. You begin to carry memory not only in the mind, but in the tissue, in the posture, in the hue. You become a being whose presence is meaning, and that changes everything. How you gather, how you relate, how you imagine others see you. The moment the body became visible in a new way, it also became vulnerable in a new way. And from that tension, between being seen and staying safe, arose a new human reality: the negotiation of selfhood in public space. Skin, in this context, became the mediator between inner experience and outer expectation. It allowed for performance, for concealment, for ritual, for resistance. But it never stopped being biological. You could paint it, scar it, clothe it, erase its hair, ornament its surface. But underneath all that remained the pulse, the heat, the breath. No matter how much culture tried to shape the self, the body still whispered the truth. And so the dual nature of human identity was born, not only thinking beings, but sensing ones, not only symbolic minds, but expressive skins. Even now, in a world of layers and lenses, we remain creatures who react to a glance, who tremble under a touch, who trust a flush more than a sentence. The body still speaks, even when we pretend not to hear it. This is why every cultural transformation, from the emergence of modesty to the invention of clothing, from the politics of race to the language of touch, has had to contend with the body, with the skin. Because it is here that the abstract becomes real. It is here that we see each other most honestly and most painfully. The skin remembers joy. It remembers shame. It remembers every time it was watched too closely, or not seen at all. And yet, despite all of this, we are still drawn to the skin, to the touch of it, to the glow of it in golden light, to the smell, the heat, the living texture. We reach out for it instinctively, newborns seeking the breast, lovers reaching for hands, friends leaning into hugs. Before there is language, there is contact. Before there is culture, there is skin, and perhaps that is the final message of this strange exposed history, that before we ever wore clothes, we wore meaning. We wore it on the body. We wore it with pride and with fear and with need. The skin was not a blank surface, it was a living manuscript, and we were not just walking animals, we were walking stories. And if we still are, then what stories are we telling now? Perhaps none so ancient, or so essential, as the story we began in the crucible of the African savannah. It was there, under an unrelenting sun, that the naked human body was tested, not by machines, nor civilization, nor even by other humans, but by heat, by time, by distance, and by the quiet violence of endurance. This was not a stage of glory. It was a trial of survival. Imagine it. No shoes, no maps, no shade, but what the acacia trees grudgingly offered. Just open space and prey. Antelope, zebra, buffalo, that could sprint beyond your reach in seconds. So how does a slow, bipedal primate feed itself in such a world? It doesn't lunge, it doesn't pounce. It runs, not fast, but long. Endurance hunting is not just a technique, it is an ordeal, one that belongs to only a few species on Earth: wolves, wild dogs, horses, and us. But even among them, humans are unique, because we do not rely on claws or fangs or speed. We rely on the one thing that predators usually fear: the heat. When the midday sun drives other hunters into shade, we remain, walking, jogging, sweating, always moving, always tracking, until the prey collapses. But such a strategy requires something radical, a body designed not for protection, but for persistence. And that's where the nakedness becomes revelation. Fur, for all its warmth and camouflage, is a liability under heat stress. It insulates. It traps warmth. The very thing that guards you from the cold becomes a curse in the sun. And so, millennia ago, we began to shed. Piece by piece, patch by patch, until nothing remained but a scattered hint: the brows, the pubis, the crown. The rest was bare, not by accident, by design, because skin breathes, because sweat cools, because evaporation saves lives. This change didn't make us beautiful, it made us strange. An animal with no fur, exposed and soft, glistening with salt. The only mammal that runs toward heat, not away from it. It was not a triumph in the heroic sense. It was a gamble, a transformation that invited damage, sunburn, dehydration, exposure, in exchange for one thing: the ability to keep going. And so we did. But heat, like time, leaves its mark. It does not pass through the body unnoticed. It carves, it tests, it punishes. For every hour run, for every prey collapsed, there was a price, not just in muscle and breath, but in the skin itself. What toll does the sun take on a body that dares to live beneath it, unshielded? It burns, it bleaches, it rewrites the blueprint of cells, but it also transforms. Beneath the punishing blaze of the equatorial sun, another adaptation began, not in the structure of the skeleton, but in the chemistry of the skin. Melanin, the pigment that darkens the skin, became the guardian of the naked body, a molecular shield. A soft armour made not of iron or hide, but of pigment, absorbing ultraviolet radiation before it could unravel the delicate code of DNA. This was no aesthetic flourish, it was survival. The bare human body under the African sun needed more than sweat. It needed protection from the invisible, the ultraviolet spectrum that breaks strands of life apart. Too much of it, and cells die. Or worse, mutate. Skin cancer, damage to the immune system, birth defects. But the human body, even in its fragility, responds with elegance. Melanin, concentrated in the basal layers of the skin, forms a natural barrier. It scatters UV rays, absorbs them, lessens their chaos, and in doing so it allows the body to remain exposed, without surrendering to destruction. This too was not uniform. It was shaped by geography, by sun, by time. Populations who lived longer in open savannas developed darker skin, rich with eumelanin. Those who later migrated north, into forests, into cloudier skies, began to lose this armour, trading it for the ability to synthesize more vitamin D from rarer sunlight. It was not a hierarchy, it was a map, a chart of environmental pressure drawn across generations, written into the body's most visible surface. But like all adaptations, it came with risks. To remain naked under the sun, even with melanin, meant constantly walking the line between resilience and damage. It meant treating every day as a negotiation between the body's cooling system and the fire overhead, between the protection of pigment and the ever-creeping threat of ultraviolet injury. A balance so precise it could only be held by evolution itself. A balance not between right and wrong, but between what allowed us to persist and what we would someday need to transcend. And so the body became both durable and delicate, hardened by exposure, softened by function. The skin, stripped of fur and strengthened by pigment, carried us through the heat, but never without cost, never without a memory of what the sun could take away. What does it mean to survive by exposure, to thrive in vulnerability, when the very world that shapes you can also unmake you? It means becoming something in between, not armoured, not soft, but strategic. The naked human body exposed on the savannah was not simply at the mercy of nature. It was in constant dialogue with it. Every choice, every adaptation was a response to the terrain, to the climate, to the demands of endurance. But this dialogue came at a price, and the cost was often written in pain. Dehydration that blurred vision, feet blistered from scorched earth, skin that cracked and peeled and bled. There was no buffer, no external layer to blame. Only the body, vulnerable, persistent, radiant. This is the paradox of bare survival. To thrive in a landscape so hostile, one must surrender something of comfort, of safety, of ease. But in that surrender, a new kind of strength emerges, not brute power, not invincibility, but a quiet, stubborn resilience that can only be forged under pressure. Our ancestors did not outmuscle the world. They outlasted it. They wore no armour, but they endured. Yet this endurance also left scars, some visible, some invisible. Skin, our first contact with the world, became the first to suffer, and the first to adapt. Calluses, tan lines, darkening over generations. But deeper still, it reshaped how we defined danger and how we perceived ourselves. To be bare in a burning world is to always be aware of limits. Of thirst, of sun angles, of the hour when movement must cease and shelter must be found. And in this trial, a question began to form, not just of survival, but of identity. Were we still part of nature, or were we beginning to stand apart from it? The nakedness that helped us endure the heat also marked us as different. We were no longer camouflaged. We were no longer protected by nature's coat. We were visible to predators, to one another, to the sun. This visibility became vulnerability, and yet it also became awareness, a new kind of consciousness, the kind that arises when a creature becomes aware not only of its surroundings, but of its place within them. How does it feel to be the only species that burns in the light it runs beneath? It feels like contradiction carved into flesh. It feels like triumph pressed into ache. It is to win the race, but collapse in its aftermath, to push further than any creature was meant to go, and to carry the heat of that distance in the bones, in the blood, in the peeling surface of the skin. The very force that gave us power was also the one that punished us for wielding it. The sun, impartial and inescapable, was both adversary and ally. We endured because we learned to suffer strategically, to suffer without surrender. There were no shortcuts, no relief but shade and water, and the hope that the day's prey would fall before we did. And in this, our evolution wrote a new chapter, one in which pain was not failure, but information. The sting of sunburn, the salt sting in the eyes, the thirst that pressed against the throat like a fist. These became early warnings, calibration tools, reminders of limits. And those limits were not just physical. They became cultural, social, psychological. A species that survives by skin must become aware of proximity, of exposure, of comfort and discomfort. And these sensations, so basic, so bodily, became part of our social fabric. How close can another come before the heat of their body becomes overwhelming? When do you offer your shadow to someone else? Who do you protect from the sun, and who must protect themselves? These were not abstract questions. They were daily choices, made without language, but not without meaning. And over time, they gave rise to the earliest seeds of community, of care, of watching over one another, not out of sentiment, but out of need. Because when one body faltered in the heat, another could take the burden. When one skin cracked, another could offer water, and thus the trial of the sun became the forge of society. But this did not eliminate the fear. To be naked in the open is to never forget that you are mortal. There is no illusion of safety, no hiding from the elements. The savanna does not flatter, it does not spare. It burns away pretension until only the essential remains: breath, motion, pain, hope. And in that landscape of extremes, the human body became a question without a final answer. How far can something so fragile be pushed before it breaks? And what kind of strength is born just before the breaking point? It is there, in that liminal space between survival and collapse, that the naked human body forged its paradoxical power. Not in perfection, but in persistence. Not in armour, but in adaptation. We did not overcome the sun, we partnered with it. A dangerous, necessary alliance. We gave up fur to cool our engines. We darkened our skin to shield our cells. We learned to read the shadows, to pace the breath, to listen to the slow rhythm of heat and wind and distance. In doing so, we became something the earth had never seen before, a creature built to endure its own exposure. And yet, even as the body learned to thrive in the furnace of the open world, another transformation was beginning. Quieter, subtler, but no less profound. Memory, anticipation, a growing awareness of limits, and a longing to move beyond them. Because while the body was adapting, the mind was awakening, aware not just of pain, but of the story that pain was telling. We began to remember the burn, to fear the glare, to seek shade not only with the body, but with the imagination. We dreamed of shelter, we imagined barriers. The bare body had carried us through the fire, but the mind was already whispering of cover, of layers, of things not yet invented but needed. Even then, deep in the evolutionary past, we were already sensing the edges of what nakedness could no longer endure. The sun had shaped us, but it had also wounded us, and that wound, invisible, yet undeniable, became part of our inheritance. To go bare was to gamble, to win by exposure, but also to suffer by it. This was the double-edged truth of the savanna. Every step taken under open sky was a testament to human endurance, and a reminder of human fragility. And perhaps that's what made it a trial, and not simply a phase. Because a trial is not something you simply survive, it is something that transforms you. The scorching winds and blinding light did not only burn the skin, they carved into the spirit. They reminded us, again and again, that the price of adaptation is never paid just once. It is paid with every breath, every heartbeat, every step into the light. And so we emerge from the fire, hairless, hardened, but never invulnerable. And as the sun fell behind the horizon and the cool dark stretched across the earth, the question lingered: how long can we live exposed to the world before we begin to dream of hiding? Because not all stayed in the open, not all kept chasing the heat across the horizon. As the ages turned, some groups of early humans moved not into the fire but toward the shade. They stepped off the blazing plains and into the softened twilight of forested edges, along riverbanks, into the cool hush of green canopies. And with that shift, subtle, slow, generational, came a transformation not just in ecology, but in meaning. The naked body that had been forged for sun and distance now entered a world of shadow, shelter, and change. Here, under the leaves, the calculus of exposure began to shift. The savanna had demanded bareness, had rewarded sweat and punished fur. But in these newer biomes, humid forests, dense valleys, wetlands veiled in mist, the cost of nakedness began to rise again. Not just from temperature, but from touch. Insects swarmed, branches scraped. The cold bit harder in shaded mornings. The advantage of a skin built for evaporation began to dull. And yet the body remained bare. For a time, it endured. Because change never happens in a moment. Adaptation takes generations. But slowly, the balance tipped. These new environments, richer in water, more varied in vegetation, less brutally consistent in heat, asked different things of the human form. Here, endurance hunting faltered, visibility narrowed, Temperature swings were sharper, and perhaps most importantly, survival no longer hinged on the ability to cool the body in open air. Other pressures crept in, pressures that whispered of concealment, of protection, of insulation. This is where the cracks began to form, not in the body, but in the advantage that nudity once provided. The bare skin, so vital in the savannah, began to seem incomplete, still expressive, still sensory, still the canvas of social life, but not sufficient, not anymore. The environment was no longer shaping us alone. It was beginning to challenge our old solutions. What happens when the body you've evolved no longer fits the place you've entered? The answer is not only biological, it is cultural. Because as early humans dispersed across varied landscapes, humid tropics, cold steppes, mountainous ridges, fog-choked forests, they didn't just face new climates. They began to imagine new responses, to feel new discomforts, to see others not just as companions, but as carriers of knowledge, of tactics, of shelter. And it is here, in these threshold places, not savanna, not tundra, but the borderlands in between, that the first true questions of covering may have begun to stir. How do you protect a body no longer punished by the sun, but by the unknown? In the dappled quiet beneath the trees, danger shifted its form. It no longer came as blistering heat from above, but as invisible bites in the night, sudden chills in morning mist, thorns that clawed the skin as silently as breath. Insects carried disease. Wet foliage clung cold against the ribs. The body, stripped for heat loss, now faced a world where insulation was once again necessary. But this time, fur would not return. Evolution does not rewind. The human skin had crossed a threshold. It could not grow what had been lost. It could only respond now with creativity. And so, dispersal became invention's accomplice. The first great human migrations, subtle waves rather than singular events, took us into climates our bodies were never designed for, into darker woods, deeper valleys, cooler coasts, into places where the bare body, once a tool, now became a liability. And though these changes unfolded over tens of thousands of years, their direction was irreversible. The naked advantage was fading. What remained was a challenge: adapt behavior or suffer consequence. How do you survive in a body optimized for a biome you've left behind? This question didn't yield an immediate answer. For generations, adaptation was partial. Fires were built more frequently. Shelters became more elaborate. Animal skins may have been draped across shoulders. Not sewn, not shaped, but wrapped. Symbolic before practical. Cultural before technological. Because the human response to discomfort was never purely instinctual. It was social. If one elder wrapped their infant in bark or hide, others learned. If a group noticed fewer bites on a person covered in clay, they mimicked. And so the earliest coverings, or if we can even call them that, were likely not clothes in the modern sense. They were gestures, provisional, experimental. Bark rubbed on skin, ash smeared against the cold, furs lain over sleeping bodies. These were not garments. They were attempts to renegotiate the terms of exposure in a world that no longer rewarded it. This shift wasn't just about temperature, it was about meaning. The savanna made our bodies visible, the forest made them vulnerable. What was once efficient became conspicuous. The body's signals, sweat, shiver, flush, were no longer only social cues. They were potential liabilities, to predators, to parasites, to the cold, which doesn't negotiate. What does it mean when survival depends not only on what you can endure, but on what you can imagine sheltering yourself from? And what kind of mind begins to wonder not how to endure the body, but how to extend it? A mind that is starting to turn inward, a mind that does not merely react to the world, but reflects on its place within it. As human groups spread beyond Africa, moving slowly along coastlines, river corridors and inland routes, the environments they encountered were no longer just physical tests. They were cognitive puzzles. Different predators, different weather patterns, different light, different food, different rhythms of silence and danger. And with every mile gained, the naked body became more conspicuous. It was not built for snow, not for fog, not for trees dripping with cold, and so the body did not adapt. The mind did. This is where culture began to outpace biology. where knowledge, not mutation, became our most powerful adaptation. The body, still naked, became a platform for creativity. Coverings became intentional, functional. In the forests and marshlands, where temperatures dipped and insects crawled, human groups likely began to modify hides, cutting, tying, layering. Not yet fashion, not yet clothing as identity, but clothing as necessity, as memory, as an externalized solution to an internal question: what do I need to survive here? And in these scattered moments, across valleys, across generations, a profound shift was taking place. Because no two landscapes asked the same things of the human form. The further from the equator our ancestors moved, the more diverse their solutions had to become. In some places, nudity persisted. In others, bodies were smeared in oils, or painted in clay to insulate, to signal, to soothe. In colder edges, skins were held close, not sewn yet. That leap would come much later, but carried, wrapped, layered, shared. These early choices, inconsistent and local, were the beginning of something irreversible, the separation of the body from the environment by human intention. And once you begin to separate, even slightly, you cannot help but reshape. Because coverings are never just about climate, they're about perception, comfort, custom. Once one group begins to wrap, others must decide whether to imitate or differentiate. And with that, clothing ceases to be only environmental. It begins to be social. To wear something is to send a message. To remove it, another. The body, long a natural canvas, now finds itself framed. And so we must ask, when the first coverings appeared, did they protect against cold or against the gaze? What if the deeper invention was not warmth, but privacy? Because even before clothing was clothing, before stitching, tailoring, or textiles, it was already a choice, a gesture, a statement. The moment the human body was deliberately concealed, even partially, something changed in the social field. A new boundary emerged, not enforced by nature, but imagined into being. A piece of hide wrapped at the waist or draped across the back did more than guard against the chill. It declared, however subtly, this part of me is not for everyone. And that idea of privacy, of modesty, of control over visibility was perhaps as revolutionary as fire. Under the trees, in the hush of greener worlds, this new language began to take shape. The more covered the body became, the more charged its exposure grew. What was once always visible, thigh, hip, chest, could now be revealed. Deliberately, symbolically, a dance, a challenge, a rite. Clothing didn't just hide. It created the possibility of meaning through unveiling. The clothed body was not just protected, it was reframed. But why now? Why in these new environments? Because in places where the environment no longer dictated every breath, where shade was ample, where water softened the urgency of heat, humans had space to think, to decorate, to differentiate. The cold did not vanish, nor did danger. But its tempo changed. And into that slower rhythm stepped a new kind of creativity, the ability to shape how one appeared, not just for utility, but for interpretation. Here, the cultural began to overtake the ecological. Groups living just miles apart could respond to similar weather in radically different ways. Some might continue mostly naked, relying on fire and shelter. Others might adorn themselves in feathers, in bark, in animal parts, not only for function, but to tell stories. Who are you? Where are you from? Who do you belong to? The body became a canvas for these questions, and with every loop of fibre, every wrap of skin, identity emerged, not just individual but communal. This was not uniform, it was messy, improvised. Some groups remained nearly nude for tens of thousands of years, others covered more, less differently, based not solely on need, but on meaning. Because once the seed of culture is planted, it does not grow in straight lines. It grows wild. It braids biology with imagination. And in that wildness, the human form began to fracture from its environment. Not violently, but with care, with intention, with vision. And as vision expanded, so too did the gap between what we are and what we choose to appear to be. In that gap, clothing would one day rise. But for now, something quieter stirred. A question that could not be asked aloud, yet pulsed beneath each pelt and painted mark. Who am I? when I am no longer only what the world sees? That question lingered beneath bark canopies and river mist, following our ancestors deeper into the forests, the valleys, the shifting climates of a wider world. With every new terrain came not only environmental challenge, but the pressure to reimagine the self. Because the moment you begin to cover the body, for warmth, for concealment, for ritual, you also begin to create a space between what is natural and what is chosen. The forest, unlike the savanna, offered concealment without effort. Shadows fell thick, vision was shorter, dangers less visible. Yet this concealment, once ambient, began to feel like something worth carrying with you. In that slow drift from environment to adornment, coverings began to signal control, not just of temperature but of attention, of dignity, of who gets to look and who doesn't. Clothing, in its most primitive form, was not just a response to cold or bite or branch. It was an early experiment in autonomy. And from this autonomy, social worlds deepened. Now, it mattered how you presented yourself. And to whom? Covering could communicate age, status, readiness, danger, fertility, grief. Not everywhere, not all at once. But incrementally, the forest and its cousins, the reed swamps, the jungles, the colder borderlands, became the testing grounds for the human self. Abstracted. Still, the body remained underneath. Still, the skin remembered the sun, the chase, the exposure. But here, in the shadowed world, survival had changed shape. It was no longer just about muscle and breath. It was about flexibility, invention, and perhaps most of all negotiation, with the land, with the tribe, with one's sense of self. The body, once governed almost exclusively by the laws of biology, was now subject to something more fluid, more mutable. Culture. This moment in deep time, where the naked form enters shadow, where covering begins to evolve from instinct to intention, marks a subtle but irreversible transition. From animal to symbol maker, from bare to adorned, from being shaped by the earth to slowly reshaping it in turn. And still we ask, was this the beginning of protection or of performance? What had we lost when we stepped away from the sun? What new self was forming there in the trees, half seen, half cloaked, learning how to be human, clothed not in fur or fate, but in choice? What happens when nakedness becomes more than a condition? When it becomes a story the body can no longer tell without consequence? For hundreds of thousands of years the human form was simply what it was. Exposed, expressive, unguarded. A tool among tools. A system of cooling, signalling, sensing. Its vulnerability was not weakness, but honesty. To be seen was to exist. To move under sun and stars with nothing between flesh and world was not yet immodest. It was only natural. But somewhere in the long dusk between instinct and reflection, something shifted. The body, once only visible, became visible to itself, to each other. And that awareness, sharp, quiet, irreversible, cracked open a new emotional terrain. Not just exposure, but shame. When did we first feel it? Not the burn of heat or cold, but the burn of eyes. The moment when a glance was no longer merely recognition, but judgment. A child reaching instinctively to cover themselves when watched. A man looking away not from cold, but from the weight of seeing another body unveiled. These are echoes of something ancient, something deeper than fashion or culture. They are clues. Because modesty, as psychology reminds us, is not taught from scratch. It emerges early, universally, in nearly all societies. A quiet choreography of hiding and averting, of covering and yielding. So where does it come from? Perhaps from our uniquely human mind, capable not just of feeling, but of imagining how we are seen. Theory of mind, social cognition, the awareness that others can observe us, interpret us, define us. No other animal worries about being perceived, no other creature blushes, but humans do. Not because we are clothed, but because we are capable of being known. To blush is to be caught, not by hands, but by perspective. And that perspective, once internalized, becomes a mirror we carry even in the dark. The birth of shame was not a fall. It was a bloom. Painful, perhaps, but rich in its implications. It taught us boundaries. It sparked the earliest codes of modesty, long before laws. It told us, in whispers and winces, that some parts of ourselves might need shielding not from the world, but from each other. But why? Why would evolution favour this discomfort? Because cohesion, not just survival, was key. To live together, in groups, in tribes, in trust, required more than strength. It required negotiation, sensitivity, restraint. And the body, bare and brilliant, had to be tempered. Not silenced, but softened. Shame, then, was not a flaw. It was a form of communication, a signal that we understood the rules, that we could be trusted not to violate, not to impose, not to take without invitation. But what are the consequences of living with a body that must always ask permission to be seen? It changes how we walk through the world. It alters the rhythm of our gestures, the intent behind our silence. It makes the body no longer just a surface, but a negotiation between desire and decorum, between presence and discretion. And in the earliest human groups, where survival hinged on cooperation, this internal negotiation became a kind of moral gravity. Those who knew when to avert their gaze, when to cover, when to remain still. These were not merely polite. They were safe, trustworthy. They understood the unspoken architecture of shared life. Because to be fully visible is to be potentially disruptive. In small bands of early Homo sapiens, cohesion was everything. Food had to be shared, children protected, danger spotted in time, and harmony, social, emotional, even aesthetic, became a quiet imperative. The body, already expressive through skin and posture, now needed additional layers of control. And from this came the stirrings of modesty, not just in action, but in intent, a sense of which bodies could be looked at, and when. Who could see whom, and how? These early cues were likely inconsistent, evolving from context, from age, from ritual. But they planted the seed. Nakedness could now be inappropriate. And so a paradox emerged. The very body that once helped build trust through exposure, through the honesty of sweat and scent and exhaustion, now required concealment to maintain that same trust. The rules had changed because the mind had changed. We were no longer animals simply surviving. We were symbolic thinkers, weaving meaning into fabric, gesture and gaze. And once something carries meaning, it becomes powerful, dangerous, sacred. Nakedness, once unremarkable, became charged. Its presence could destabilize. Its absence could signify respect. In this new emotional ecosystem, shame did not mean guilt. It meant awareness of others, of boundaries, of the body's ability to provoke or disrupt. It marked a shift from instinct to interpretation, and with that shift, the body began to split, not physically but socially. There was now the natural body and the regulated one, the seen and the allowed to be seen. What began as survival in shadowed forests was now becoming something else entirely. A code, a moral map of exposure. And shame was its compass, not punishing but guiding, telling us how to belong. But belonging has a price. And the body, always present, always vulnerable, would become both the currency and the canvas of that price. What happens when the thing that once made us human, our nakedness, becomes the very thing we must hide to stay human? It means that identity itself becomes layered, that the body is no longer just biological terrain, but moral territory, a place where meaning is mapped, where rules are written not in stone, but in skin. And in the earlier symbolic minds, this mapping began to deepen. We don't know exactly when it started, but at some point, the body became more than a vessel. It became a message, not only of health or status, but of virtue, of discipline, of control. Because shame, unlike pain, does not come from the outside in. It emerges from within. It requires self-awareness. And that self-awareness and the ability to imagine oneself as seen, to internalize the gaze of others, is one of the great revolutions of the human mind. It paved the way for art, for language, for law. But it also brought with it the possibility of judgment, of exclusion, of feeling wrong simply for being. And the body, so immediate and inescapable, became the first thing judged. We see early glimpses of this in ochre-stained burials, in figurines whose exaggerated bodies hint at reverence, but also at rules, in cave art where humans are rare, and when shown, are clothed, masked, or hidden. We do not know for sure why, but these are not simply aesthetic choices. They are signs of a growing distinction between what can be shown and what must be symbolized, between the physical body and its moral interpretation. This is the true beginning of modesty, not as behavior, but as concept. To feel shame is to be part of a group, to measure yourself against invisible lines, to internalize the values of the tribe. And the more complex those values became, the more the body had to adapt, not in its structure, but in its role. It could still run, hunt, bear, nourish. But now it also had to obey, to signal virtue, to be appropriate. And with that obedience came the first quiet violence, because not every body fit the new standards, not every moment of exposure was forgiven. Shame, once a whisper of belonging, could become a shout of exclusion. And the naked body, once our earliest truth, could now be a site of transgression, of taboo, of punishment. This was not universal, not everywhere, not always, but the pattern had begun. And as we look deeper into our past, we begin to see the roots of a world where being seen is never neutral, and where the body, even before clothing, was already dressed in meanings. But what happens to a creature who cannot escape its own surface, and yet must constantly justify it? It becomes a being of masks, not deception, but modulation, presentation, subtle signalling. The earliest humans didn't just respond to their environments, they curated themselves within them. And the body, once a tool for surviving heat and cold, became a mirror for social values, how one stood, how one covered, how one looked or looked away. These were now more than gestures, as they were rituals of belonging. The role of shame in this shift cannot be overstated, because shame is not the enemy of connection, it is often the architect of it. To feel shame is to know that others matter, that their view of you has weight, and in that awareness, early humans found structure, codes, a way to regulate behavior without constant surveillance. A child who feels shame after doing something wrong will often correct themselves, even when alone. This internalization, the ability to carry society inside one's mind, is what allowed humans to scale up, to form larger groups, to trust strangers. And so shame, paradoxically, became a foundation of civilization. But it came at a cost, because the body does not forget its old rhythms. The urge to move, to sweat, to touch, to be free, these did not vanish. They were simply folded into rules. And rules, once established, have a way of outliving their reasons. What began as practical, cover to stay warm, to signal respect, could slowly become doctrine, myth, law. And the body, our oldest inheritance, became something to manage, to discipline. This is where the moral weight of the body began to rise. Not just how it moved, but how it looked, what it meant. In some groups, nakedness became sacred, in others, forbidden. But in all, it was marked. Not just skin, but symbol. And that symbol could be dangerous, and because it reminded us of what we were before the rules, of our animal past, our vulnerability, our hunger. And so shame did something else. It gave us distance. It allowed early humans to build structures of control around the body, to designate times and places where certain exposures were allowed, ritual, birth, death, ceremony. And at all other times the body was to be dressed, if not in clothing, then in posture, in propriety, in restraint. This wasn't uniform, but it was profound, because it meant that to be human was no longer simply to exist. It was to manage one's existence, to perform it, to conceal, reveal, and interpret the self through layers not of fabric, but of meaning. And beneath all of it, always, the question, am I allowed to be seen like this? This question, once whispered by the body to itself, became the silent pulse of human social life. It shaped how we gathered, how we gestured, how we punished and praised. It rippled out from the body and into the myths we told, the rituals we invented, the boundaries we drew. Across time, across landscapes, across cultures, this need to manage the gaze, to curate the body, became one of the clearest markers of our species' unique emotional architecture. And as symbolic thought matured, so too did the stories we wrapped around the skin. The body became the site of morality, not just in behavior, but in belief, a place where purity could be imagined, where sin could be assigned, where certain coverings denoted respect, and certain exposures evoked danger or seduction. These meanings shifted with geography and history, but always beneath the fabrics and customs lay the echo of that earliest transition, from being looked at to feeling exposed. In this sense, shame was a cultural scaffold, one that allowed human groups to function with greater nuance and cohesion. By creating zones of the body that were private, communities could regulate intimacy, trust, and danger. It allowed people to control who had access to their physicality, and by extension their vulnerability. Nakedness was now a threshold, not just of skin but of permission, and what was once open to the wind, the sun, and the soil now required social clearance. But even more than that, shame planted the seed of a deeper duality, the idea that there could be a split between the inner and the outer self, that the body, which had once been the self, was now something separate, something to manage, display, refine, or hide. This was a subtle but profound shift. It allowed for abstraction, for reflection, for identity to begin existing beyond the visible. We stood in our own skins and wondered if we should. And from that wondering came art, came ritual, came rules. The body was painted, pierced, wrapped, adorned, each mark an attempt to speak without speaking, to tell others, I belong, I believe, I am different, I am the same. Shame did not erase the body, it amplified its meaning. So we arrive at a paradox. The same sense of shame that made the body a thing to hide also made it a thing to honour, to elevate, to sanctify. The temple veil and the royal robe share the same ancestry, the impulse to draw a line between the sacred and the seen, and so we ask, not just what shame took away, but what it built, a world in which the body, once silent, began to speak. And from that speech an entirely new kind of human emerged, not just a body in the world, but a body seen, remembered, interpreted, and ultimately chosen. Before there were needles, before there were stitches or seams or the weaving of cloth, there were symbols, carried not in books but on bodies. The earliest humans did not wait for the cold to dress themselves. They adorned long before they armoured. Long before clothes protected the body, symbols adorned the soul. Long before garments preserved warmth, pigments preserved meaning. What does it mean that we wore metaphor before we wore fabric? The archaeological record does not begin with trousers or tunics. It begins with red. With ochre, powdered iron oxide gathered from the earth, mixed with animal fat or water and smeared across skin. It is one of our oldest behaviours. Ochre appears in human sites stretching back over 300,000 years, long before the first preserved scraps of hide or thread. It was not applied for heat. It did not shield from thorns or sun. It marked, it highlighted, it spoke, not in language, but in presence, in gesture, in ritual, in echo. And from ochre came beads, deliberate, patient creations from shells and bones, pierced and worn around necks, wrists, ankles, each a decision, each a symbol. But what were they saying? A bead has no warmth. Ochre does not insulate. These were not survival tools in the conventional sense. They were tools of identity, of recognition, of belonging, perhaps of mourning, perhaps of pride. They were the first garments not for the body, but for the self, and they raise a question rarely asked. What if the first clothes were not coverings, but declarations? Because something profound happens when a species begins to decorate itself. It means that the body has crossed a threshold, from function to expression, from presence to performance. And that expression is not arbitrary, it is deeply human. To adorn is to choose, to select one colour over another, one material over another, to say, I am this, not that, I am with these people, not those, or perhaps, I am neither, I am myself. What must it have felt like to wear meaning, to string shells gathered from a distant shore and feel not only the weight of nature, but the intention of culture, to see your own hands stained red not from blood or berry, but from an ancient need to signal, to remember, to transform? And why, if symbolic adornment is so old, did clothing, true, stitched, tailored clothing, emerge so late? It is a strange delay. one that archaeologists and anthropologists still ponder, because Homo sapiens were anatomically modern for over 200,000 years before the oldest known needle appears. Our brains, our hands, our tools, all capable. And yet, the earliest evidence of tailored clothing doesn't arrive until perhaps 50,000 years ago, with bone awls and hide scrapers, and even then, only in certain regions. Why did we take so long to cover what we were so eager to decorate? And what does that say about what we thought clothing was for? Not protection perhaps, not at first, but communication, transformation, a way of taking something external, an object, a pigment, a hide, and making it part of the self. This is the paradox at the heart of early human adornment. It was both deeply personal and entirely social. A shell bead on a cord might have no warmth to give, but it could speak of lineage, memory, or alliance. A body marked with ochre might not survive the cold night better, but it could pass into death, or across ritual thresholds, with a kind of dignity that survival tools alone could not provide. This is where the line between clothing and culture begins to blur, because for tens of thousands of years, humans seem to have worn ideas more than garments. The symbolic mind was already alive, etching marks into bone, arranging ochre nodules, selecting specific animal teeth to hang in precise arrangements. This was not instinct. This was imagination, curating the body as a canvas before it, was ever shielded as a vessel. We must ask, what is a garment if not a form of self-definition? And if identity came first, not cold, not wind, then the invention of clothing becomes not a reaction to discomfort, but an extension of symbolism. The difference between body covering and body meaning is subtle, but crucial. Clothing, in the way we think of it today, is always doing both, protecting and projecting. But in the beginning, it may have only done one. The bead did not keep the rain out. The stripe of red did not make the hunt easier, but it made a person something, a mourner, a lover, a leader, a memory. And so clothing in its earliest form was an act of storytelling. Even before we stitched, we narrated. This explains the curious timeline we find in the archaeological record. Because while practical clothing leaves few traces, especially if it was made from soft, degradable material like bark or leather, symbolic items endure, beads fossilize, ochre stains, bones survive. And what we see, over and over again, is that symbolic culture emerges earlier and more persistently than tailored clothing. That isn't an accident, it's a message. Our ancestors weren't rushing to cover their bodies, they were moved to extend their meanings, to make statements, visual, tactile, wearable, that declared their presence in the world. And those statements, long before they became shirts or cloaks or woven tunics, were enough. Enough to belong, enough to mourn, enough to be remembered. What if the true origin of clothing wasn't about warmth or modesty at all? What if it was about continuity, about carrying something of yourself forward, across time, across death, across the firelit eyes of those who remained? To adorn was to persist, not just in memory, but in identity. A shell bead might outlive its wearer, a smear of ochre might fade from skin, but linger in the soil of a burial. These were early signatures, not of ownership, but of existence. The human desire to be seen, to be known beyond the immediate moment, may have found its first solution not in words, but in ornament. And this pushes the meaning of clothing into a different realm entirely, one where garments begin not as insulation, but as messages. We were signalling creatures long before we were sheltering ones. When we look at early symbolic culture, we see more than creativity. We see an urgency, an emotional need to mark life, to punctuate its most fragile transitions. Birth, coming of age, death, union, separation. These moments were not left to pass in silence. They were worn. And in the absence of durable textiles, bodies became the tablets upon which meaning was etched, painted, hung, and remembered. And here, clothing, in its proto-form, was deeply sacred. To wrap a corpse in a shroud, to place ochre beneath a sleeping child, to pierce bone and wear it close to the heart, these were not for utility. These were early forms of continuity, a way to ensure that something survived, even when breath did not. And this brings us to an idea that haunts the human story, the longing to be carried forward. Clothing, then, may have begun as ritual persistence. But something changed. As climates shifted and humans expanded beyond the warm equatorial cradle of Africa, utility slowly crept into adornment, a hide worn not just to honour the hunt, but to block the wind. Bark fibre tied not just to mark status, but to bind warmth. The symbolic and the practical began to intertwine, slowly, imperceptibly, meaning never left, but survival began to shape it. The bead did not vanish. It migrated to the fringe of the hide. The ochre still stained the skin, but now beneath a cloak. This was not a loss, but an evolution. We did not trade meaning for protection, we merged them. The earliest garments were not merely shields, they were signs. They told stories, not just about temperature, but about temperament, not just climate, but culture. And so, long before weaving and sewing gave us tunics and robes, humans already wore something much. And the soul, in its quiet longing, began to dress itself long before the body demanded it. The earliest garments, then, may not have covered skin, they covered stories. They wrapped around memory, status, and belonging. A necklace of pierced teeth was not warmth, but warning. A sash of woven fibre was not protection, but proclamation. What we wore said what words could not yet carry. Before language matured, clothing spoke, and then, slowly, across tens of thousands of years, the wind changed. Humans spread north. The savannas gave way to tundra. The forests darkened. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the body, no longer able to rely on the ambient heat of the sun, began to suffer. Meaning alone could not keep out frost. Symbols, however sacred, did not insulate. And so, necessity joined hands with expression. Clothing became not just metaphor, but material salvation. Yet even here, symbolism remained. A fur wrap was not worn simply because it was available. It was shaped, arranged, fastened. Clothing was still curated. Even the most practical hide bore marks of preference and pattern. A strip cut evenly. A tie made from sinew. The evidence in burial sites, especially from Ice Age Europe, shows that garments were decorated, fringed, etched. They had style, they had signature, and that signature meant something. It meant the human had not disappeared under the demands of cold. Even at the edge of survival, expression endured. Because to be human was not merely to endure, it was to define one's endurance. And so the garment became a layered thing, warmth and identity, necessity and story. In the Arctic chill or highland winds, we find clues in needles made from bone, scrapers for hides, grooves in ornaments worn atop furs. We even see a symmetry, a left shoulder exposed, a right covered, suggesting not randomness, but tradition, culture, identity codes etched into the way people dress themselves. And once again, we return to the idea that adornment preceded and shaped clothing, not the reverse. It was not that clothing gained meaning, it's that meaning gained clothing. By the time humans began stitching hides together with precision, they were already masterful wearers of meaning. The thread was new, the impulse was ancient. So when we say, the first clothing, we're not pointing to a single invention, a moment when someone decided to cover their skin for warmth. We are speaking of a continuum, a slow unfolding, a shift from shell to sash, from stain to stitch. We clothed the body because we had already clothed the soul, and as the needle passed through hide for the first time, it carried not only sinew but memory, not only function but desire, and not only to survive, but to be known. To be known by others, yes, by kin, by tribe, by those who might see and recognize you as one of their own, but also, more deeply, to be known by time itself. Clothing, in its earliest symbolic forms, was never just for the now. It was an offering to the future, an echo laid gently across the body, hoping to be heard long after that body was gone, and astonishingly many were. In the grave of a child buried over 70,000 years ago, strings of perforated shells remain. In sunken caves where bones sleep beneath layers of dust, traces of red ochre still cling to skulls. These artifacts are not whispers of survival. They are declarations of intention. A child too young to hunt, too small to make tools, was still adorned. Why? Because identity begins before utility, and memory is not reserved for the useful. Even the act of burying the dead, with adornments, pigments, arranged limbs, suggests that clothing was always more than mere fabric. It was ritual, continuity, a thread through time. So when we imagine our ancestors naked, we must look again. They may not have had trousers or cloaks in the way we think of them, but they wore something older, meanings, beads tied with sinew, ochre streaks, skins cut not just for cover but for ceremony. Clothing in the deepest sense was always layered, in material, in memory, in metaphor. We wore time, we wore story, we wore the invisible. This is perhaps the most haunting truth of all, that long before the loom, long before the tailor, the human being was already draped in culture. Even when exposed to wind and sun, even when bare to the elements, the body was not merely flesh, it was signal, it was archive, it was shrine. And even now, in a world of logos and zippers, fast fashion and high design, we echo that ancient impulse. We wear black for mourning, rings for union, uniforms for role. We mark our bodies still, not only to hide them, but to show who we are, or who we hope to be. So the next time you choose what to wear, whether casually or ceremonially, know this. You are part of something ancient, a thread that began not with cold but with meaning, not with fear but with the desire to be witnessed, not to impress but to express, not to escape nature, but to expand what nature alone could not say. Clothing did not begin as necessity. It began as presence, as poetry, as a skin made of memory, worn gently and passed forward. There is a line drawn not by language or culture, but by temperature. Somewhere far north of the warm cradles of human birth, the world changed. The air grew thin and dry, the trees became brittle, the silence deepened, and the body, soft, naked, sun-evolved, reached a threshold, stay and perish, move forward and adapt. It was not a question of courage, it was a question of possibility. What happens when the body that once danced beneath equatorial skies now stands before a curtain of ice? Somewhere between 80,000 and 50,000 years ago, small bands of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa in earnest. Not in waves, but in pulses. Families, wanderers, groups drawn outward along coasts, up rivers, through deserts. As they crept northward into the chill of Ice Age Eurasia, they entered a realm not only colder than they had known, but one that was fundamentally indifferent to their biology. The thick forests and frigid steppes did not wait for human warmth. The wind cut through flesh like stone. The nights grew long and slow and quiet, and fire, that brilliant, flickering gift, was no longer a luxury. It became a lifeline. But fire had limits. A hearth might warm a huddled group for a few hours, but what of sleep? What of travel? What of hunting or birth or death, when the air itself steals heat from skin like a thief in the dark? The open body, once a canvas for sun and sweat, became a liability. What happens when the body becomes the problem? Shelter helped, but it too fell short. Caves were rare and contested. Structures of stone and mammoth bone could be built but not carried, and wind has a way of finding cracks, of slipping into every seam. Fire and shelter were not enough, not when the cold pressed in with such quiet persistence, reshaping the very rules of survival. What tools do you invent when your own body is no longer your ally? These pressures did not simply test endurance, they reshaped possibility, they rewrote the contract between human beings and their environment. Here, on the edge of ice, humans were not merely coping, they were being carved, pressed, refined. The cold was not just a condition, it was a sculptor, and every day that passed without adequate protection deepened the urgency. Because no matter how clever the mind, or how loyal the tribe, the body was soft, the cold was not. And so the slow freeze began not only to sculpt the landscape, glaciers grinding across continents, but to sculpt the human future. A choice emerged, not spoken, not debated, but lived. Adapt or vanish. Was warmth only a matter, a flame and roof, or was something else required? Could meaning and memory still be carried when the body itself was at risk of erasure? What is the boundary between survival and transformation? It lies somewhere between a shiver and a decision, between the nightly hush of freezing air and the quiet ingenuity of hands working by firelight. In the north, humans encountered not just a different climate, but a different demand. Solve the cold, or let the cold solve you. and though fire had come with them, a flickering companion passed down from countless generations, its heat was rooted, static. The fire warmed the place, not the person. It could not follow the hunter. It could not wrap around a child. And so, something new had to emerge. Not just a tool, a shift. The early shelters of Ice Age humans show remarkable creativity. Huts of mammoth bone arranged in circles, draped with hides, anchored with stones. Fire pits at the centre. Scorched earth, charcoal, shards of flint. Evidence not just of survival, but of persistence, of family, of story. But none of it was mobile, and cold. True cold is not bound by walls. It creeps, it seeps, it punishes the exposed, the still, the unwrapped. So how long could these early communities endure with fire and shelter alone? Archaeologists now believe that the human body, once so adept at endurance running and sweating beneath the sun, became its own worst enemy in the cold. Our lack of fur, once an advantage on the savannah, became a glaring vulnerability on the steppe. Unlike our Neanderthal cousins, who had broader noses, stockier limbs, and possibly denser body hair suited for cooler climates, Homo sapiens entered the cold with nothing but fire and hope. It was not enough. The limits of warmth were not theoretical. They were mortal. Hypothermia can set in within hours, fingers blacken, movement slows, the mind dulls, and even the most communal group cannot survive if the flesh fails. Fire alone, sacred, vital, beautiful, could not meet the moment, and so pressure mounted. The body, the hearth, the hut. These were no longer sufficient. Something else had to close the gap. A new kind of warmth had to be invented, one that could travel, one that could wrap itself around a person and stay there. But invention is slow, it stumbles, it experiments, and humans, as always, improvised. They began with what they had, hides from animals they already hunted. They learned to dry them, scrape them, soften them with fat or smoke. The process was long and laborious, and still, even when draped across shoulders or tied around waists, these crude coverings were often incomplete, loose, inefficient, but they were a beginning. The cold had posed a question, and humanity step by shivering step began to answer. The answer was not swift. It came through trial, through failure, through the quiet logic of need. Hides were just the beginning. They had to be made to fit, tied, wrapped, shaped, not simply worn but engineered. This was not mere survival instinct, it was early design. Around the hearths of Ice Age camps, in the flicker of mammoth bone firelight, innovation whispered. Need became craft. The slow choreography of thermal innovation had begun, but still, limitations lingered. A hide across the back left the legs bare. A wrap around the waist left gaps in the wind. Fingers numbed, skin cracked, movement remained restricted. And so, humans, who once painted caves and carved beads, turned that same creative mind to the task of warmth. The invention of the awl, a pointed bone tool, marks one of the first great turning points. Now, hides could be punctured, sewn, laced, fitted, thread followed. Tendons and sinews were stripped from animals, cleaned, dried, twisted into cord. It was slow, delicate work. But suddenly, the body could be encased. Protection became portable. Warmth walked. And with that step, the world opened again. The frozen plains of Ice Age Europe, once fatal, became navigable. Humans did not merely survive the freeze, they moved within it. The archaeological record shows a sudden expansion, deeper into northern latitudes, higher into mountains. With sewn garments, people no longer needed to flee the cold. They met it, dressed for it, faced it as a force, not a finality. But the breakthrough was not just physical, it was cognitive. To take a hide and imagine it as a second skin, to cut it, shape it, join it with others, this required abstraction, planning, trial and error. The same mind that decorated bones and carved symbols was now turning inward, refining not just tools but techniques. Clothing had become more than material, it was method, and like all methods, it could be taught, shared, improved. The cold had driven humans to a new kind of intelligence, one that wove biology, technology and community into a single thread. The pressure to stay warm had become a crucible. In it, not just the coat, but the coat maker was born. Now, every stitch told a story, not just of survival, but of transformation. And in this new chapter of human adaptation, something profound emerged. For the first time, clothing was no longer a ritual alone. It was a requirement. And with that requirement came refinement. Clothing evolved from crude necessity into complex adaptation. Over generations, patterns emerged, not only of shape and fit, but of layering. The idea that warmth could be trapped between materials, that dead air itself could serve as insulation, took hold. Hides were no longer worn flat, but doubled, fur inward, sometimes lined with grasses, moss or wool-like fibres from animals and plants. Humanity wasn't just surviving the cold, it was studying it, learning from it, responding. This era, the Upper Paleolithic, sees a blossoming of human material culture. Alongside tools and ornaments, we begin to infer more advanced clothing, fur boots, hooded cloaks, layered wrappings. While the garments themselves rarely survive, their traces do, in the polish on bone needles, the wear marks on awls, and the posture of buried bodies. Some burials, astonishingly preserved, reveal people swaddled with great care, layers of hide and fur arranged purposefully, the dead dressed not just for death but for meaning. And this meaning ran deeper than survival. Clothing had begun to divide, to specify. There were garments for warmth, but also for ceremony, some for hunting, some for rest. The act of dressing became a language, communicating role, age, function. Children were clothed differently from elders, men and women perhaps differently again. We cannot be certain of every rule, but the presence of decorated seams, layered construction, and buried accessories all point to a complexity that belies the notion of the primitive. These people were not wrapped in scraps, they were clothed in thought, and in that thought, a profound shift occurred. Clothing became a kind of infrastructure, an invisible architecture that allowed humans to push into regions otherwise inaccessible to their biology. Much like fire, clothing expanded our niche. It wasn't just a reaction to cold, it was a declaration against limitation, a way of saying, I will go where my skin cannot. I will move through a world not built for me and claim a space inside it. Thermal innovation became migration's partner, and slowly, as humans spread across colder territories, from the steppes of Russia to the permafrost of Siberia, even across the land bridge into the Americas, they brought with them not only language and stone tools, but the logic of layered skin. Clothing was no longer an accessory. It was the first architecture humans wore, the first environment they could build around themselves. It was the moment our species ceased to be bound by climate. Not because we conquered nature, but because we listened to it and adapted. The cold did not bow. It taught. And in that lesson, humanity answered with thread, with hide, with shared craft and memory. The question of how to endure had met its reply, and yet endurance was only part of the answer. The deeper story was what endurance had shaped, not just a response to the cold, but a new kind of human, one who had extended the boundary of their body outward, who had transformed vulnerability into vision. In every stitch, every softened hide, every scrape of bone into tool, there was a quiet revolution, the emergence of external biology. Because clothing was not simply worn, it was lived. It turned the body into a system, no longer naked flesh alone, but flesh in dialogue with its world. The human became modular, layered, recursive. Our ancestors began to dress their children before they could walk, to fashion coverings for sleeping, for hunting, for ritual. Clothing was no longer an act of necessity. It became an interface, between the body and the elements, between individual and group, between self and cosmos. And even now, buried deep in permafrost, we find them. Tools etched with wear, sinew needles broken mid-seam, garments folded around long frozen bones. In those remains, the story endures. A body exposed to a world that should have killed it, a mind that refused to be silent, a hand reaching for warmth and creating it. The slow freeze had done more than test humanity. It had provoked a creative outpouring as essential as language, as sacred as fire. For every gust of wind that stole heat from the skin, a solution was sown. For every hour of darkness, a new kind of light, flickering not from flame, but from foresight. And with these solutions, something else was born. Permanence. The cold made memory essential. A stitch that worked once must be remembered. A layering that saved a child must be taught. A hide cured just right must become a tradition. Out of this necessity, culture deepened. Garment became practice. Practice became lineage. We were no longer just shaping our tools, we were shaping ourselves. This was not domination over nature, not conquest. It was communion. The human body was not abandoned or shamed in the process. It was honoured by wrapping it in thought, in care, in adaptation. And slowly, the edge of what was survivable moved, not by miles but by inches, and with every inch gained, a world opened. One stitch at a time, one generation at a time, the fire still burned, the shelters still stood. But it was the garments, the soft shields we built around our skin, that turned the cold into a teacher and the body into a student. And through that learning, humanity crossed the threshold, not into comfort, but into resilience, wrapped not just in hide, but in hope. In a forgotten shelter of wind and stone, beneath skies torn with ice and silence, a hand once held a sliver of bone, no longer meant to pierce flesh, but to bind it. Not a spear, not a knife, a needle, fragile, thin, the size of a child's finger. But in that tool, its point polished to brilliance, its eye hollowed with careful patience, a revolution began, not of conquest but of connection, not of death but of warmth, and it was silent. No clang of metal, no firestorm, just thread pulled through hide stitch by stitch in the glow of firelight. And somehow that small motion, repeated in darkness, changed what it meant to be human. 40,000 years ago, deep in the Paleolithic night, the first bone needles appear in the archaeological record. Carved from the bones of birds or slender mammals, they are astonishing in their delicacy. They do not look like accidents. They do not look like first attempts. Some bear grooves, some symmetry. All bear the unmistakable trace of intention. But what drove that intention? What cold, what hunger, what dream shaped the bone into such a purposeful form? It is hard to know where. A Siberian cave, a French shelter, a dry pocket of Mongolia. The discoveries come scattered, like sparks in snow, but together they whisper of a shift, a species no longer satisfied with mere wrapping, with loose hides draped and tied. No, now the body could be shaped, encased, articulated. Clothing could be made to move with the limbs. It could flex, stretch, hold. It could cover joints, protect fingers, wrap feet. The body was being reimagined, not simply protected from the world, but integrated with it. What kind of mind looks at a hide, at a tendon, at a shard of bone, and sees a system? Tailoring was not a single invention. It was a cascade. Bone awls had already existed, crude points for punching holes. But the true needle, with an eye to carry thread, required more than utility. It required an aesthetic leap. The understanding that material could be joined not just by force, but by finesse, through small, precise penetrations, through flow, through design. And with that leap came 1,000 possibilities. Now garments could follow the body's contours, they could stretch across the shoulder, wrap the thigh, bend at the elbow. This was no longer animal skin bound to human form. This was a second skin, imagined and constructed. Every stitch a decision, every seam a negotiation between function and form. What changes in a species when its tools begin to trace its own silhouette? The spear may feed, the wheel may carry, but the needle transforms, and it does so in silence, in the dark, with hands that do not strike, but weave. And as they wove, they reshaped not only what humans wore, but what humans could be. Tailoring was more than protection. It was permission. Permission to roam farther, to sleep beneath open stars in frost-bitten valleys, to ascend into alpine cold, to hunt in snow, to birth in safety, to live where life had once refused to root. The needle, slender and silent, unlocked the cold world. But this expansion came at a cost. Tailoring is laborious. It requires time, patience, practice, and planning. Each garment had to be conceptualized before it could be cut. A sleeve needed a shoulder, a boot needed a sole. Nothing could be improvised. Every stitch linked a moment to the next. This was not survival alone, it was foresight, and foresight, once kindled, never retreats. The tools of early tailoring were few but exquisite: polished needles, fine awls, cords of sinew or plant fibre. Yet the garments they created were likely layered, articulated, intentional. Some burials, like those found in Sungir, Russia, contain not only beads and ornaments, but the faint impressions of tailored clothing, shaped close to the body and likely decorated with symbolic precision. These weren't rags, they were engineered identities, and they mattered. Because tailored clothing didn't just shield the skin, it dignified it. It said, "You are not at the mercy of this world. You are not only prey to the cold, nor slave to the wind. You carry within you the power to reshape the environment's demands. You do not conquer, but you converse. And with each seam, that conversation deepens. Imagine the scene, a family gathered near fire, wind howling at the tent seams, and someone, young or old, threading sinew through a bone needle, stitching a new cuff, repairing a seam, fashioning a wrap for a child not yet born." These moments were not dramatic. They were quiet, repetitive. But in that repetition, culture was made. Knowledge passed, roles defined, the act of sewing became social, and social became survival. For tailored clothing could not be made by one person alone. It required skill passed down, shared labour, collective investment. Someone hunted, someone scraped, someone softened, someone stitched. The garment was not a possession. It was a product of community, an artifact of trust. And so, from this simple tool, barely larger than a twig, came an entire architecture of cooperation. A needle, threaded and held in cold hands, bound more than fabric. It bound the species. And in that binding it changed the human story, not through fire or fang, but through fabric. For the first time in evolutionary memory, the external environment no longer held total dominion. The needle gave humanity not just warmth, but agency. It made the body adaptable, not in the slow rhythm of genes and generations, but in real time. In a single season, a community could fashion new garments suited to a new threat, a new terrain, a new ritual. Tailoring became an extension of thought itself. But beyond function, something more subtle began to stir. When clothing fit the body, when it could be shaped, tightened, layered, it invited expression. Decorative stitching, trimmed hems, patterns in thread. The difference between covering and adornment blurred. And that blurring revealed something astonishing. Humans were no longer dressing just to survive. They were beginning to dress to signify. This is the twin legacy of the needle, warmth and meaning. The symbolic possibilities of clothing now unfolded. A stitch could carry memory. A colour could signal status. A shape could mark gender, generation, kinship, or clan. Clothing became an outward display of inner life, of who you were, where you belonged, what you valued. And the needle was the chisel. We see this echoed in burials like that of the so-called Sungir children, found with thousands of ivory beads sewn into their garments, beads that would have required hundreds of hours to create and attach. These weren't just clothes, they were cosmologies. Garments became story-bearing skins, stitched not only with thread but with identity. And that identity, once wearable, could be transferred, handed down, taught, garment as heirloom, stitch as tradition. It is easy to overlook this revolution because it does not shout, but the needle whispers through history, altering everything. It does not dominate like the spear. It does not reshape the land like the plough, but it threads through every other act of humanity, enabling journey, softening hardship, dignifying ritual, and it leaves behind the smallest of traces, a hole in hide, a sliver of carved bone, a wear pattern at the tip of a tool. These are the ghosts of tailoring, and they tell us the human story is not only one of might, it is also one of craft, and this craft rippled outward, from the warmth of a single body to the structure of entire societies. As tailoring became more refined, So too did the complexity of garments, and with it, the complexity of roles. Who stitched? Who wore what? Who adorned whom? Clothing began to map the social architecture, not merely protecting flesh, but locating people within a cultural matrix. The needle didn't just draw thread through hide, it drew invisible lines between individuals, between generations, between symbols and status, weaving community into cloth stitch by stitch. And as the garments grew more intricate, so did their meanings. Decoration became language, repetition became ritual, patterns could signify tribe, readiness for marriage, achievements, mourning. In a world without written words, tailoring became script. The body, once a surface of raw exposure, was now a canvas of narrative, and yet the work remained quiet, done in the hush between hunts, in the warmth of family. The needle created no ruins, no monuments, only function, only form. And because of that, its legacy can be missed, passed over for the more visible triumphs of stone and spear. But every expansion into colder climates, every child carried across ice, every ritual elder buried in a ceremonial wrap, all point to this silent thread winding through time. Tailoring didn't just make survival easier, it made permanence possible. The logic of clothing was cumulative. Each stitch was a data point, a lesson retained, a solution remembered. This is perhaps the most human of all qualities, not simply to adapt, but to encode the adaptation, to retain it, to transmit it. The needle was an early recorder of memory, far older than the scroll, quieter than the drum, but no less potent. And as those memories were passed, between fingers, across fires, through generations, they began to shape identity itself. To be human was no longer simply to have a body, but to shape it in cloth, to signal belonging, to wrap the self in story. Even today, when we wear clothing far removed from necessity, synthetic, symbolic, self-expressive, we echo that first motion, a hand guiding thread through a small, polished eye, a line of connection, a gesture of warmth. The needle remains with us, not always visible, not always remembered, but present in every fold, every stitch, every subtle signal of who we are beneath what we wear. The needle, in its silence, did not forge empires or split atoms. It did not build monuments, but it built something else, continuity, a thread running from Paleolithic hearths to modern hands, from bone and sinew to fabric and pattern, from survival to identity. That thread, wound through time, is how we carried knowledge, not on scrolls, not in code, but in fibre, in form. Each stitch was a lesson, each garment a map of human ingenuity. The tailored garment was no mere covering, it was a memory worn on the body, a soft, dynamic archive of climate, culture, and care. A child clothed in a coat sewn by elders was not only protected from the cold, they were wrapped in generational labour. The warmth was not just physical, it was ancestral. Across icy plains and wind-blasted steppe, garments grew layered and complex. Stitching followed the rhythm of need, yes, but also the rhythm of story. One stitch for protection, one for ceremony, one for beauty, one for kin. No two were ever the same, no needle moved without meaning. We find their traces even now, not in the hides, which rot and vanish, but in the tools that shaped them, in the grooves of bone needles, in the tension worn into awls, in the placement of beads sewn onto ancient sleeves, garments dissolved. But their echoes endure, and their legacy is everywhere. Today we wear textiles unrecognizable to our ancestors, polyester, nylon, smart fabrics. But the gesture, the act of wrapping the self in chosen material, remains. Every outfit is a whisper of that first motion, a hand threading sinew through bone, a stitch pulled tight against cold, a decision made in darkness, not just to survive, but to signify. Because even now, we do not dress only for weather. We dress for identity, for love, for grief, for joy. We dress for memory. And the needle, though often unseen, remains our oldest partner in this quiet practice. Its invention marked a turn, from body to symbol, from shelter to selfhood. It allowed us to carry more than tools. It allowed us to carry meaning, across miles, across millennia. What is the needle, then, if not the first pen? a stylus for skin, a writer of warmth. Not every revolution roars. Some are whispered, some are sown, and this one, born of necessity, refined by care, stitched the human experience into permanence. So when you thread a needle, when you repair a seam, when you pull thread through cloth, know this: you're performing one of the oldest human rituals, a ritual of resilience, of recognition, and above all, of remembrance. It began with warmth, with survival, but it did not end there. What we wrapped around our bodies soon began to reshape more than skin. It redrew the human form itself, not in bone or blood, but in perception. And somewhere along that quiet arc, the naked body, once ordinary, once everywhere, vanished. But where did it go? To cover is to protect, yes, but it is also to conceal. With the rise of clothing came a new form of absence. The natural state of the body became a private one, a state to be hidden, to be revealed selectively, and thus to be invested with meaning. The bare form, once the default of existence, became a statement, a taboo, a question, a tension. And so began the long choreography of visibility. What parts of the body could be seen, and by whom? What was sacred? What was profane? Across cultures and climates, these lines varied wildly. But the line itself, the division between what was exposed and what was obscured, became universal. Clothing transformed the human body from a unified surface into a mosaic of permissions and prohibitions. Shoulders in one place, hair in another, ankles in yet another. Each boundary marked not by biology, but by belief. We must wonder, when did the act of dressing cease to be about warmth and begin to be about control? With concealment came categorization. Gender, age, status, all began to be written not only in the body but upon it. Garments were no longer simply worn, they were read. And like any script, they could be misinterpreted, censored, edited. Clothing became code, and the naked body, once neutral, became a deviation from that code. This was not a loss of freedom, entirely. It was a shift of terrain. Because to dress is not merely to hide, it is to declare. And as those declarations accumulated, in fabric, in colour, in cut, they began to structure the human world. A new architecture of roles emerged, not enforced by muscle or even by law, but by the fabric against the skin. A belt, a veil, a hood, each one spoke without words. But what did they say? That you are married, that you are mourning, that you are young, or ready, or forbidden. Clothing carried the weight of ceremony and shame alike. It became a passport through the social landscape, granting entry or denying it. The naked form, once universal, became disruptive, even dangerous. It threatened the system of signs that had begun to define the human tribe, and so, to be clothed was to belong, and to be bare was to become visible in the wrong way, not as a body, but as a question. And what do societies do with questions that make them uncomfortable? They cover them, they cast them out, or worse, they forget they ever existed. And so the naked body, once central, began to vanish not only from sight, but from thought. Its absence became normalized, expected. To see it, outside of ritual, intimacy, or violence, became transgressive. A private thing glimpsed in public became scandal, or art, or crime. In some cultures, a bare breast nursed children without remark. In others, it became an object of punishment. In all cases, the body was no longer neutral, it was interpreted. What we show, and what we do not, became a form of law. Not just civic law, but the subtler law of culture, of gaze, an internalized architecture of permission. In every generation, children learn what parts of their bodies are to be hidden, and when. The act is never fully explained. It doesn't need to be. It's learned in glances, in gestures. A shirt tugged down, a towel held close, eyes that look away. And through that subtle curriculum we learn more than modesty. We learn the body has rules, and once those rules exist, they can be applied unevenly. To women more than men, to the poor more than the rich, to strangers more than kin. To those whose bodies do not conform to the dominant ideal, heavier, older, scarred, the burden of invisibility grows heavier. Clothing, meant to cover, now polices. It becomes a gatekeeper, not just to warmth, but to worth. But visibility is not only about shame, it is also about power. What is concealed is controlled, but also protected. Clothing began to function like a border between public and private, between self and society. In ancient times, veils were not just religious, they marked elite status. The covered woman was not always oppressed. She was set apart, unavailable, enclosed, enshrined. So too did garments begin to define roles, not just bodies. The apron of a baker, the feathers of a shaman, the robe of a judge. The uniform made the role visible, and in doing so, made the person partially invisible beneath it. The individual yielded to the symbol. You no longer saw a man or woman. You saw the role, and the role spoke louder than the flesh beneath it. This was the paradox of clothing. It could obscure to protect, or obscure to erase, and sometimes both. Even today, our wardrobes are not just choices, they are negotiations, with weather, with context, with hierarchy. What you wear to a funeral, to a job interview, to a protest. Each one speaks before you do, and in that speaking the body recedes. What was once us becomes what covers us, and what covers us becomes what defines us. And the skin, the actual skin, is left behind, not as taboo alone, but as an enigma. A ghost beneath fabric, still present, still felt, but no longer seen. And what is unseen becomes powerful, or perilous. The invisible body holds a strange gravity. In its absence, we imagine it, distort it, project onto it. When we are denied the sight of something natural, we begin to mythologize it. Desire sharpens, judgment hardens, a silhouette glimpsed becomes more potent than a body revealed. In this way, the hidden form becomes more than skin. It becomes symbol, and symbols are rarely neutral. Through clothing, the naked body became not only obscured but abstracted, a site for moral judgment, for social anxiety. Is this proper? Is that allowed? Who decides? The answer is never just one culture or law. It is a web of expectations, spun over centuries clinging to us still. To be clothed is not just to wear fabric, it is to wear history, and history, like clothing, rarely fits all bodies the same. As clothing styles multiplied, so too did their messages. Layers came to mean modesty or status, tightness, allure or deviance. Colours became codes, cuts became categories. The clothed body became a text to be read and misread, especially by those in power. And often the burden of that misreading fell hardest on women. A neckline too low, a hem too high. Clothing turned judgmental, and the body beneath it guilty by default. And so the fabric became not only shield, but sentence. To be visible in the wrong way was to invite correction, condemnation, or worse. The naked body had not simply disappeared, it had been banished, politicized, criminalized. Its presence could be framed as threat, its absence as virtue. A strange inversion had taken place. Nudity, once universal, had become a scandal, and yet the body remained, always there, beneath the cloth, responding to heat, to cold, to gaze. The skin could not forget it was alive. It flushed, it sweated, it trembled. The clothed body might be hidden, but it was never silent. Through posture, breath, proximity, it continued to speak. It resisted total erasure. But the social weight of visibility endured. Who gets to be seen, and how, remains a form of power. To be visible on one's own terms is a privilege. To be exposed against one's will, through surveillance, through shame, through violence, is a form of theft. The politics of clothing are not just about style or religion or climate. They are about consent, about who controls the boundary between skin and world. And as those boundaries grew firmer, more policed, the public self and the private self began to diverge. Clothing created a mask, not false, but filtered. It allowed people to enter shared space not as raw beings, but as roles, to present rather than expose, to perform rather than simply exist. The body, meanwhile, learned to wait, to live inside this new architecture, half hidden, half yearning to be known. And yet, within this duality, new strategies emerged. The clothed body wasn't only a site of suppression, it became a site of performance. Through dress, people crafted versions of themselves. Identities could be exaggerated, muted, disguised. The self became a curated exhibit, shifting with setting, evolving with occasion. Clothing offered not just protection from gaze, but control over it. This was power of a different kind. To choose what is seen and what is not, this is agency. In many cultures, garments became theatrical tools, ceremonial robes, festival masks, painted skins beneath transparent veils. Visibility itself became a kind of dance. When to reveal, when to conceal, and why. The naked body didn't vanish. It became rhythm. It appeared in the spaces between fabric and movement, in the slippage between role and reality. But there was a cost. As clothing helped sculpt our outer identities, the boundary between public and private selves hardened. The skin beneath became more than hidden. It became othered. What once was ordinary now required occasion, intimacy, permission. We began to live in layers, not just of cloth, but of expectation. Vulnerability moved inward. It nested in the body, tucked behind, seams, and that reshaping was psychological. We came to associate nakedness not just with exposure, but with loss of control. To be unclothed was to risk being misunderstood, or worse, truly seen. Not as a role or reflection, but as oneself, the self beneath the name, beneath the garment, beneath the gaze. And so, the self split. There was the self we dressed, and the self we dressed over, the one that obeyed the codes of modesty, of status, of belonging, and the one that remembered wind on bare skin, firelight on thighs, rain against the back. That self remained, but quietly. Like an animal that returns only at dusk, yet even dusk was shifting. In time, clothing began to reach into the hours once governed by shadow, sleepwear, undergarments, invisible fabrics layered upon invisible fears. The clothed body became permanent. Ritual nudity faded. Communal bathing receded. Even childbirth, even death. These too were draped. Privacy became default. The unclothed body, once the norm, was now the exception. And exceptions drew scrutiny. So what was once our natural state became a revelation. The naked body had become an event. A thing to prepare for, to fear, to revere, to hide, or to reclaim. And through it all the fabric thickened, not just in thread count but in metaphor. We no longer lived only in environment, we lived in attire, in curated identity. The body was still there, breathing beneath it all, but it had learned silence, learned stillness, learned to speak in other ways, in gesture, in intimacy, in longing, waiting not to be seen perhaps, but to be recognized. And maybe that is the deeper shift clothing introduced. Not the simple hiding of the body, but the invention of the internal gaze. To clothe is to reflect, to measure the self against what is expected, accepted, admired. When the body is always covered, it becomes imagined. We dress not just for others, but for the idea we have of ourselves. We edit the mirror, we curate the silhouette, and the skin waits. Beneath the fabric, the body continues its silent life. It heals, it hungers, it grows old. But rarely is it acknowledged unless it fails. A blemish, a bulge, a breach of the visual contract. The clothed world has little tolerance for imperfection, even as every body carries it. This too is the legacy of invisibility. The idea that what is hidden should be ideal, and yet the body is not ideal, it is real. And the return to realness, to skin, to nakedness, is not just a removal of clothes, but a shedding of narrative. The story we wear every day must be laid down. Only then can we remember that the body was not born flawed. It was born fluent. It spoke in sweat and gooseflesh, in breath and blush. To uncover it is not indecency, it is intimacy. But our cultures taught us otherwise. To show too much was arrogance. To show too little was prudishness. The line between exposure and expression became tightrope thin and heavily policed, especially for those whose bodies defied the norm. Fat bodies, disabled bodies, trans bodies, brown and black bodies. The invisible became not only unseen, but unseeable, cast out of the visual imagination altogether. This is why visibility matters, not spectacle, not performance, but presence. To reclaim the body from shame is to reweave a broken thread. a line stretching back to when skin was not symbol, but self. When being visible was not about being judged, but being acknowledged. And perhaps slowly that thread is mending. Movements toward body neutrality, nudist spaces, art that refuses erasure. In these moments the fabric thins, not in literal cloth, but in meaning. The idea that the body must always be managed begins to soften, and the body breathes, not to return to a natural state. There is no going back, but to dwell more gently in the one we have, to dress not in defence but in delight, to wear what reflects, not conceals, to remember that skin is not a sin but a story, written before fabric, carried beneath it, waiting still to be heard. To become visible again is not a threat. It is a return, not to innocence, but to wholeness. And in that return we do not lose culture. We make it human again. We dressed ourselves not just to survive, but to become. Once the body was immediate. It rose with the sun, bare to the wind and ash, bathed in light without interpretation. It simply was. But the moment we clothed ourselves, not just in warmth, but in form, in colour, in cut, we split the body from the self. Something ancient shifted. Identity, once gestured in scars and gait, now shimmered in texture, shimmered in adornment, shimmered in the stories woven into what we wore. When did we begin to see ourselves through layers? The first layers may have been animal hides, bound at the shoulder or waist, crude but potent. These weren't just tools against cold, they were statements. Who had hunted, who had given, who had received. Later, it was shells, beads, ochre, bone, not for survival, but for meaning. The earliest signs of individuality emerged not from shelter or flame, but from decoration. We clothed not just the skin, we clothed the spirit. And from this weaving of flesh and intention, something stranger was born. We began to recognize status, not strength or age alone, but position. That one belonged above, and this one below. A necklace of lion's teeth was not just memory, it was hierarchy. The tilt of a headdress was not just style, it was a symbol. Clothing became vertical, it climbed ladders, it carved lines between the hunter and the herder, the elder and the initiate, the seen and the silenced. What had once been warmth became warning. I am not like you. And the body, once naked in its truth, became a medium of strategy. In this new aesthetic battlefield, power no longer resided in the bones. It lived in the silhouette, the tallness of a hat, the precision of stitching, the rarity of dye. Across the ancient world, from Nile to steppe, from forest edge to frozen plain, the clothed body became a cipher, a riddle meant only for those who knew the code, who could afford the thread, who understood the ritual of dressing not just to cover, but to assert. How do we begin to believe in our own costumes? In time, garments stopped being expressions and became obligations. To wear incorrectly was to offend. To dress above one's rank, heresy. Dress codes fossilized, norms hardened. Even colour could betray your role. Crimson for kings, soot for slaves. Each choice of fabric narrowed the space of self. The naked body was no longer just unprotected. It was rebellious, disruptive, unthinkable. We were now citizens of cloth. But with each new layer, did we gain control or lose intimacy? This was the trade. The ability to define oneself in exchange for the need to conform. Clothing gave us tools to project power, but also mirrors that distorted who we were. When a child looked at their reflection in the river, did they see their face, or their father's expectations stitched into every seam? What happens when we no longer meet the world in our own skin, but only in disguise? The disguise, after all, became a second nature. It was not a lie, but a lens, one that shaped both how we were seen and how we saw. A humble cloak did not simply warm the shoulders, it altered the stance. A belt drawn tight changed the gait. A certain weave could mean you were to be listened to, another could mean you should remain silent. Slowly the line between being and appearing thinned, until it became almost impossible to tell where the body ended and the story began. And the stories multiplied. With clothing came not only self-expression, but an architecture of distinction. People became categories. The veil or the collar or the carved bone at the throat told others what role one played, long before a word was spoken. Identity moved outward, became costume, became caste. You were not just a person, you were a type, a station, a code. This was the scaffolding of early social order, not merely tribe or kin, but occupation, ritual, control. The priest wore one colour, the labourer another. The warrior's chest gleamed with the marks of death and honour, sewn or painted or pinned in place. Each stitch told a story, and none of those stories were private. In fact, they were meant to be read. To enter a gathering was to be scanned, sorted, positioned. But when society learns to read clothing, it also learns to enforce it. Deviation became danger. A child who wore the symbols of a warrior too early was corrected. A woman who adorned herself with dyes reserved for chiefs might be shunned, or worse. Clothing no longer simply revealed, it regulated. It was law, encoded in linen and bone, a language written not on parchment but on people. And within this codified world, the idea of the true self began to fracture. If you could not dress as you felt, then who were you? If your outward symbols were inherited, status, gender, role, then what remained inside that was truly yours? The naked body, stripped of these signs, became not only forbidden, it became ambiguous, discomforting, a puzzle without its key. Without clothing, people no longer knew how to place each other, and to not be placed was to not belong. So we clung to our layers, not just for warmth, not just for protection, but to exist within a shared narrative. The robe told others you were devout. The stripe across your arm said you had lost someone. The texture of your shawl whispered wealth, or struggle, or mourning. These signals weren't frivolous. They were survival, social, spiritual, political. But beneath the costume, something quieter persisted. A breath, a pulse, a presence. The body remembered wind, remembered mud, remembered the time before language, before labels. It didn't protest loudly, but it waited. Waited for a moment to be known, not through symbol, but through sensation, through skin. Yet in most places, that moment never came. The world moved forward, toward cloth, toward class, toward constraint. The naked body, once the primary medium of experience, was now considered incomplete without its uniform, and with that uniform came a deepening abstraction. Life became an ongoing negotiation between the inner and outer self. You were not only what you felt, you were what you wore, and that equation was not balanced equally. The privileges of expression, of bending the rules, were not distributed across all bodies. Some could transgress and be called eccentric. Others, simply for existing outside the norm, became targets. Dress codes were not only cultural, they were punitive. To dress wrongly was to be accused of impurity, rebellion, indecency, betrayal. Clothing enforced order, but it also enforced silence. And in that silence, the idea of the natural self began to fade. You did not feel the sun on your back unless in solitude. You did not run without shoes unless poor. You did not reveal your chest or hips unless performing or punished. The body, once our shared common ground, had become an artifact, a thing to be managed, concealed, shaped. The skin, no longer the interface between human and world, became private territory, fenced off by fabric. And this separation was more than cultural. It was philosophical. To live in clothing is to live in metaphor. We speak of putting on a brave face, of wearing your heart on your sleeve, of tightening your belt, or unbuttoning your soul. These expressions are not accidental. They reflect the intimate link between clothing and psyche, a vocabulary of layers, permissions, performances. When the body is layered, so is the self. The rise of social hierarchies meant that identity was increasingly imposed rather than discovered. One did not simply feel. One had to announce, through jewellery, through robes, through the very absence or abundance of fabric. Clothing became a kind of performance art, necessary, even sacred, but far from neutral. And in this theatre, roles were rigid. A garment could dictate your mobility, your labour, even your destiny. In ancient Mesopotamia, distinct fabrics and embroidery marked temple prostitutes from priestesses. In early China, laws restricted certain silks and colours to specific ranks. In caste systems, a barefoot step or unallowed dye could result in punishment. Across continents and millennia, fabric held more than warmth. It held law. But identity built on rules can calcify. And in that calcification, the body grows quiet. It folds itself into the expectations it is given. And when it cannot, it hides. The self that cannot find room in the outer script retreats to the inner stage, whispering through dreams, through longing, through touch. Still human, still whole, but layered now in more than cloth. Those layers, invisible yet intimate, shaped not just how others saw us, but how we saw ourselves. In the beginning, the body had been an unfiltered interface with the world, sensation, movement, breath, all flowing freely. But now the body had become the base upon which roles were inscribed. With each generation, the layering grew subtler, more entangled. A child born into a village might inherit not only their parents' skin tone or eye colour, but their manner of dress, their patterns of gesture, their allowable forms of expression. And through these garments, the self was taught its borders. You are this, not that. Wear this, not that. Walk here, not there. The world was no longer navigated through instincts alone. It was learned through ritual, through fabric, through the scripts encoded in sleeves and seams. And those scripts were not passive. They trained the body to speak silently. A bowed head, a covered wrist, a particular cut in cloth that whispered allegiance or submission. The body, ever adaptable, conformed. But somewhere, the skin remembered the old way. It remembered immediacy. The sudden gasp of stepping into cold water, the warmth of midday sun on the shoulders, the sensation of movement untethered. These moments became rare and precious. They survived in dance, in rites of passage, in dreams. The dream of being seen not as a title or a function or a garment, but simply as oneself. Yet even this dream was shaped by the new reality. Because once clothing had changed how we were perceived, it also changed what we thought was possible. No longer did we ask simply, who am I? But, who should I be, and how should I appear to be that? Identity became a puzzle of presentation. The visible became strategic. Even in the earliest communities, adornment shaped access, to food, to marriage, to space, to memory. Those without the right garment were often forgotten, or forbidden. So the body adapted again. It became fluent in disguise. This fluency allowed for survival, but also for fragmentation. One self for the family, another for the village, another still held inside, secret even from words. Clothing gave birth to roles, and roles demanded masks, elegant, elaborate, comforting perhaps, but masks nonetheless. And what was lost behind the mask? The self that had once spoken in gesture, in heat, in proximity. The self that did not need adornment to belong. That self did not disappear. It simply found new places to hide. In poetry, in rebellion, in moments of solitude when the layers slipped off and the wind returned. That wind, it did not ask your status. It touched you as it touched the trees. And for a brief moment in its quiet insistence, it asked not what you wore, but who you were beneath it. The wind does not lie. It touches the raw self, the skin unmediated by ritual, unmeasured by hierarchy, unhidden by expectation. And in this fleeting contact we glimpse the cost of our great invention, that as we layered fabric, we also layered distance, between self and other, between self and world, between the inner voice and the outer role. Yet this distance was not without its uses. It made civilization possible. Layers enabled decorum, distinction, control. They made space for complexity, the child who would become elder, the apprentice who would one day lead, the ritualist who moved between spirit and matter. Clothing became time made visible, a garment not only of place but of becoming. The adolescent might not yet hold power, but their beads could point to the path ahead. The mourner might not speak, but their dark cloth would carry the grief for them. And in this choreography of dress and meaning, humanity wove something enduring. We invented culture. We created roles so that life could be navigated with ritual, with beauty, with clarity. And perhaps we needed those roles, those markers. In a growing world of many voices, fabric helped shape identity as both anchor and sail. A person could be claimed by their community and still carry their own private winds. But the question still flickers. Did we gain a self, or only a costume? If the body is always wrapped in expectation, Can we ever truly know it, or be known? The layers that protect us may also isolate us. They shield us from judgment, yes, but they may also shield us from connection. A glance at the eyes no longer reaches the shoulders. A hand on the back feels only wool. The story told by skin, warmth, cold, tension, calm, is filtered, dulled, or silenced. And yet we yearn not just to be safe, but to be seen. Not in exposure, not in spectacle, but in recognition. To be read not through cloth alone, but through breath, posture, stillness, through the subtle music of being. We crave spaces where layers are choices, not cages, where the naked body is not taboo, but testament. Not always, not everywhere, but sometimes. In art, in intimacy, in ritual, in protest, in dream. These are the moments when the self re-emerges, not as defiance, but as remembrance. A return not to the past, but to possibility. To stand again, briefly, unlayered, and feel the air, not as threat, but as witness. To be clothed in nothing but presence. This is not the end of clothing. It is the rediscovery of what lies beneath it, because the self was never invented in fabric. It was only hidden there, waiting, patiently, for someone to look past the threads and meet the human being inside. Even today, beneath linen and leather, silk and synthetic weave, the skin waits. It listens. It remembers. We walk through glass cities, encased in layers, adjusted for temperature, trend, or modesty. But the ancient body beneath does not know it has changed. It dreams the same dreams. It hungers the same hungers. And in the soft veil of sleep, it strips itself bare, over and over again. Why do we so often dream naked? Not provocatively, not always sexually, but vulnerably, awkwardly, as if our minds are rehearsing something forgotten, something unresolved. A rehearsal not for performance, but for recognition. A rehearsal for being seen. This nakedness is not a return to childhood, though it shares its innocence, nor is it always rebellion. It is something older than either. A phantom limb of our species' long memory. The skin remembers being seen, not through the eyes of shame, but through the eyes of sameness. Before cloth drew borders, the body was the border. The psychological imprint of our naked past did not vanish with the first thread of woven flax. It receded, deeper into the subconscious, into art, into ritual, into longing, and sometimes into silence. But what is silence, if not the space where memory waits? Consider the first time you were told to cover yourself, not by nature, but by another. Was it a command or a lesson, a scolding or a whisper? Somewhere between heat and cold, between exposure and concealment, we began to associate nakedness not just with vulnerability, but with error. To be unclothed was not just to be cold, it was to be improper, dangerous, incomplete. But if this was true, why do so many of our myths begin with the unclothed body? Adam and Eve walked naked in a garden not of sin but of unawareness. Only after the knowledge of good and evil did they sew fig leaves, as if morality itself required fabric. In the Greek imagination, heroes and gods moved unclothed across battlefields and heavens, not ashamed, but exalted. In Hindu cosmology, ascetics reject garments not in madness, but in pursuit of truth, the naked body symbolizing a stripping away of illusion. These are not scattered exceptions, they are echoes of a species grappling not just with cold, but with meaning. What happens when the body becomes metaphor? Nakedness begins as a state, then it becomes a symbol, then it becomes a threat. Not to the self, but to the systems that build themselves around concealment. Societies that define status through fabric must also define deviance through its absence. And so, the naked body is pushed to the periphery, into sacred spaces, into punishment, into art, yet it refuses to vanish. It returns on canvases, carved into temples, staged in theatre, whispered in dreams. We are haunted not by shame, but by recognition. Something inside us sees the uncovered form and remembers a time before remembering required clothes, and perhaps that is why the naked body, though draped and dismissed, never truly disappeared from our culture. It returned not in daily life, but in dreams, in devotions, in defiance. Where rules became rigid, the body responded with metaphor. Through sculpture and song it stepped back into the light, not to provoke, but to persist. Art became its sanctuary. From Venus figurines buried in Paleolithic soil to Renaissance nudes painted in reverence, not lust, the body found a way to be seen again. It was carved in stone with reverence, painted in oils with longing, danced into firelight with memory. It was never just a body. It was always something more, a question, a key, a mirror. What does it mean to be human? Artists turned again and again to the flesh as their answer. But not everyone approved. As civilizations hardened their rules, the naked body became dangerous again. The same torso that once symbolized strength now signaled seduction. The same breasts that once fed the future now had to be hidden from it. A line was drawn between beauty and obscenity, and it was rarely consistent. What was worshipped in temples was censored in homes. What was sculpted in marble was covered in schoolbooks. We hid what we couldn't unsee and shamed what we secretly still revered. This paradox lives at the core of modern modesty. We wear clothes for warmth, yes, but also to participate in a social contract, to be appropriate, to belong. Yet the very persistence of nudity in our stories, our fantasies, our fears, suggests that we have not truly let go. The body remains a boundary and a beacon. It signals life, death, birth, vulnerability, power. It marks what we are, what we pretend not to be, and what we long to become again. Rituals reveal this duality. In funerals, the body is sometimes bathed and shrouded, prepared as if stepping backward into some ancient symbolic nakedness. In birth, the first gasp of air hits raw skin. No costume, no pretense. The entry and exit points of human life are still clothed in the language of exposure. We come in naked, we often leave the same way, wrapped not in fabric but in ritual meaning. And there are other spaces, hidden but enduring. Tribes who still conduct ceremonies in partial or full nudity, not for eroticism but for spiritual continuity. Monastics who renounce clothing to renounce illusion. Performance artists who return to the body as the most honest canvas. These are not relics of savagery, they are not regressions. They are reminders that beneath the symbolic systems we have built, the skin is still speaking. We just forget how to listen. But now and then, a moment slips through. A painting, a memory, a dream. And in it, we are not ashamed. We are simply human, standing again in the light. But that light is fleeting, and for many, forbidden. In much of the world, nakedness is no longer simply out of place. It is illegal. What once was natural has become, in many societies, a crime. Public nudity is punished not because it is inherently violent, but because it is disruptive. It interrupts the illusion that we are not, underneath it all, still animals, still mortal, still vulnerable. But the body is not dangerous, it is only honest. Honest about need, about aging, about hunger and sorrow and joy. When we remove the layers, whether physically or metaphorically, we do not descend into chaos. We return to clarity. We remember the softness of our own skin, the strangeness of our own hands, the miracle of being shaped this way, and no other. That memory is not erotic. It is sacred. And yet, it is policed. Because clothing does not only hide, it controls. Who may be seen, how, and by whom. Who may uncover themselves in art, in medicine, in war, and who may not. The naked body is not just a form. It is a question mark. And questions threaten those who prefer order without ambiguity. A covered body is legible. A naked one demands interpretation. This is why nakedness persists in dreams, even among the most modest of cultures. There, in the privacy of sleep, the conscious mind relaxes its grip. It allows the self to step outside the costume, not to perform but to feel. Shame may still echo there, but it often echoes beside freedom. A paradox we cannot shake. Even fashion, the very art of clothing, reflects this tension. The cut of a dress, the low hem of a tunic, the sheer veil, the revealed collarbone. Every garment is a negotiation between concealment and suggestion, between the remembered power of the body and the fear of what it might awaken. In that tension, we find allure, but also amnesia. We forget that the fabric we revere is a recent addition, that for the vast majority of human history we were without it, and somehow fine. Not only surviving, creating, loving, mourning, moving across continents, making fire, language, tools. Nakedness did not hinder humanity. It was humanity. We were not waiting to be clothed to become ourselves. We were already ourselves, and the earth met us skin to skin. So why do we now flinch from that contact? Why does a bare chest scandalize, while a war-torn uniform does not? Because clothing has become narrative. It tells a story we've agreed to believe, that civilization began when the skin was hidden. But the truth is quieter. It is older. It lies in the silence of dreams, the brush of breeze on uncovered flesh, the hush of memory. We did not stop being human when we put on clothes, but we did start forgetting what it felt like before we did, and still the body knocks gently at the door of memory, not with fists but with fingertips, in the tingling of skin after a hot shower, in the moment before dressing, when we catch our own reflection and feel neither shame nor pride, but something quieter, something ancestral, a recognition without words. In that liminal space we are not old or young, male or female, rich or poor. We are simply bodies, beings, alive. And then we clothe ourselves again and re-enter the story. Clothing, after all, is not just a barrier. It is also a sentence in the language of the self. Through it we say, I am this, I believe this, I belong here, or I refuse, I resist, I remember. Even the act of nudity, when chosen, is not regression. It is authorship, a way of reclaiming a sentence we forgot how to write. But the script has changed. In modern societies, nudity is often reduced to spectacle. Its sacredness is diluted. The body is commodified, airbrushed, consumed. Not encountered, not honoured. The ancient conversation between flesh and world, the honest aching presence of being alive in a skin, is muffled by marketing, by shame disguised as decorum, by confusion sold as confidence. And yet the echoes continue. They resound in the cracks, in ceremonial dances where the body paints itself instead of dressing, in healing practices that touch skin with reverence, in whispered traditions where children are still taught that their body is not a problem, but a story they are allowed to know, a story they are allowed to tell. This is not about rejecting clothing. It is about remembering what came before it, and what still lives beneath it. The way a breeze makes the hairs on your arm rise, the way skin craves sun after a long winter, the way grief feels heavier when it's carried in wool, the way joy, too big for our seams, erupts in dance, in laughter, in motion. The body still speaks, even through cloth. But when do we listen? Perhaps in art, perhaps in the quiet of dusk, when we shed our garments not for ritual, not for meaning, but simply because the day is done, and for a moment we are just ourselves again. No layers, no roles, no mirrors, only presence. This is the echo that endures, not scandal, not temptation, but return. A return to the first truth of being, that we are born without costume, and it was enough, that we touched the world, and the world touched back. That no matter how intricate our garments became, no matter how clever our stitching, the skin never stopped remembering. And in that remembering we are not weakened, we are whole. Not in spite of what we wear, but because we once wore nothing and survived. Not by accident, but by design. The human body exposed was not a mistake. It was an achievement, an instrument tuned by sun and sweat and time. We endured because of our nakedness, not in defiance of it. And though the fabric came, and, with its complexity, hierarchy, invention, the body beneath it never disappeared. It waited, and it still waits. Every culture, no matter how veiled or layered, carries remnants of its naked beginnings. In language, the word bare still implies truth. In idiom, stripping something down means finding its essence. In ritual, clothing is often removed before birth, before burial, before baptism. In our most profound transitions, we return to skin, not to diminish, but to mark something real. Because the skin is the final witness. It carries our memories, not just biological, but emotional. The warmth of a parent's embrace, the sting of a slap, the quiet comfort of a lover's hand. Long before we spoke, we felt, Long before we dressed, we touched. Our first knowledge was tactile, it still is. And in moments of great change or grief or revelation, we often find ourselves yearning to feel again, to return to that primal intimacy with the world. Clothing has served us well. It is art. It is armour. It is culture woven thread by thread. But it is not origin. It is not essence. And though it shapes how we are seen, it does not define who we are. What defines us is our capacity to remember, to feel the echo of wind on ancient skin, to recognise that somewhere inside we are still walking upright through tall grass, unadorned, alert, still seeking shade, still reading the world with the pores of our body, not just the lens of our mind. This is not nostalgia. It is inheritance, because in every moment that we allow the body to simply be, unjudged, unperformed, we reconnect not only with ourselves but with our species. We remember that before gods wore robes, or kings wore crowns, or warriors wore armour, there was just this, the body, breathing. That breath is still here, under the cotton, under the denim, under the armour of expectation. The breath continues. The body remains. It is not waiting to be freed or flaunted or shamed, only honoured, only felt. This is not a call to undress. It is a call to remember that we are not our fabric. We are not our roles. We are not the myths written upon our sleeves. We are something quieter, older. We are the memory of wind on skin. We are the echo of nakedness, still humming beneath the threads. To return is not to regress. It is to remember. The story of clothing, of modesty, of concealment has always seemed to point forward, toward civilization, toward technology, toward culture. But what if the path forward now spirals back, inward, toward the body that began it all? What if nakedness, not as spectacle or shame, but as memory, is the final threshold we cross on the journey of understanding? Not the place we left behind, but the mirror we eventually must face. The viewer, you, have walked a long path, across savannas and under canopy shadows, through ice-blasted plains and ochre-painted caves. You have felt the fire's warmth and the needle's puncture. You have watched the birth of shame, of fabric, of form, and now, on the far side of it all, the question returns. What was the skin trying to tell us? It was not weakness, not exposure, not temptation. It was continuity, a living thread that connects breath to time, sensation to survival. Long before language could describe it, skin remembered. Every goosebump under wind, every burn beneath sun, every graze from another's touch became a record, a sensory archive older than any textile. And the further we covered it, the more that record fell silent. But the body does not forget so easily. Deep in the architecture of the brain, circuits still light up in response to temperature, to pressure, to naked proximity. The limbic system, that ancient seat of instinct, has not evolved away from the raw immediacy of skin. Evolution does not erase, it adapts, and so our neural pathways continue to respond to the world in ways shaped by our furless ancestors, tracking heat, anticipating touch, mapping intimacy through physicality, not abstraction. So what does it mean that we began without clothes, and remained that way for tens of thousands of years? It means we were built from the beginning to survive with nothing but ourselves. Our endurance was not housed in garments, but in our naked adaptability. To cool ourselves not by hiding from heat, but by sweating into it. To chase prey not by outmuscling it, but by outlasting it. The skin was not a flaw, it was our strategy. It was porous, reactive, expressive. It was armour made not of resistance, but of responsiveness. And in the end, it was enough. Until it wasn't. Until ice crept further south. Until fire no longer reached far enough. Until the nights lasted longer than our bodies could endure. So we adapted, we learned, we stitched, we covered. But in that covering, did we also forget what we were made of? And if so, what would it mean to remember again? Not with logic, not with doctrine, but with breath, and with touch, and with awe. Because memory, like the skin, is not linear. It ripples, it resurfaces, it softens what once seemed firm. As we revisit the idea of nakedness, not as absence but as presence, we begin to understand it was never the clothes that defined us. It was our ability to feel the world directly and to choose how we engaged with that sensation. Clothing did not betray the body, It extended it. A second skin, crafted not in opposition, but in dialogue. Animal hides were not foreign to us. They were kin, worn not to deny our animal nature, but to carry its strength. The earliest garments bore no seams of shame. They were tools, like the hand axe or the fire pit. They were continuity, not erasure. And with that act of wrapping the self in other forms of life, we began a new intimacy with the world. Clothing became not just an interface between humans and the cold, but between humans and story, between skin and symbol, between experience and expression. We began to wear our memories. The red of ochre whispered of blood and birth. The stripes of paint and pelt marked the difference between hunter and elder, mother and mourner. Over time, fabric took on the work of the body, not just to protect, but to communicate, to represent what could no longer be shown directly. So we lost the immediacy of nakedness, but we gained a new kind of visibility. We became layered creatures, not just in dress, but in meaning. And that layering, though it complicated us, also enriched us. The cloak did not silence the skin, it became its echo, the dance of texture and weight, of warmth and breathability, of exposure and concealment. These were conversations, not constraints. But only if we remember to listen, to see clothing not as barrier, but as bridge, a reminder that every fold was once necessity, every stitch, a solution, and beneath it all, the same skin that felt the savanna heat still pulses with memory. The same skin that once shimmered with sweat under a relentless sun still stretches, still scars, still sings. So we do not return to the skin in rebellion, we return in recognition. That vulnerability is not weakness, but truth. That what we once wore was not fabric, but presence. That beneath the fur we never had and beyond the clothes we made, we are beings built for sensation, built to feel wind, built to touch others, built to know the world not just with our eyes, but with our whole body. And so, in the gentle quiet of remembering, we come back to the skin, back to the story it still longs to tell. And what is that story whispered through the pores, humming beneath linen and leather? It is not one of shame or triumph. It is a quiet chronicle of being, a record not written in ink but in sunburn and goosebumps, in the imprint of grass on a resting back, in the way touch still means something even when we pretend it doesn't. This is the language we spoke before words, and it hasn't gone silent. It's just been muffled. Because deep beneath the surface of every ritual, every custom, every hemline, there is still the memory of what it meant to stand unguarded, to stand not in defiance, but in participation, with air, with water, with fire, with another's gaze, and not to be consumed by it, or reduced to it, but to be with it, fully. Nakedness, in its oldest form, was not about exposure, it was about inclusion. We were not separate from the world once, we were inside it. The line between body and environment was blurred, porous. Skin was not the limit of the self, it was a meeting point. And so every gust of wind, every bead of sweat, every touch of bark or bone or flesh was a conversation, not a confrontation. There was no audience, only presence, no stage, only moment. But today, when we are naked, it is often under fluorescent lights. It is medical or erotic or comedic. Rarely is it sacred. Rarely is it enough just to be as we are, without apology or agenda. Rarely is the body welcomed without performance. And in that dissonance, something ancestral flickers. Some part of us remembers when nakedness was not spectacle, but norm. Not absence, but fullness. We forget this not because we are shallow, but because we are layered. Layered with culture, layered with meaning, layered with the protective cloaks of survival, now transmuted into habit. The journey into clothing was a brilliant one, but brilliance does not negate origin. We can hold both, the wonder of invention and the honesty of skin, and in doing so we reconcile. We stop seeing the body as primitive and start seeing it as primary. We stop dividing ourselves into dressed and undressed, civilized and wild, sacred and profane, and start understanding that all of these states live within us, always. That even when clothed, we are still animals, still ancestors, still born from warmth and water and open air, so we return, Not to abandon the future, but to embrace the past more fully. To see the arc of humanity not as a straight line away from the body, but as a spiral that curves back inward, touching again the source. Skin as beginning, skin as memory, skin as home. And in that home, we are not alone. We are communal. We are shared. We are at last together in the echo of our origins. And yet, even now, the echo continues to evolve. Nakedness is no longer simply about biology. It has become symbolic, layered with cultural meaning, artistic expression, protest, play. But beneath all those meanings lies a foundation older than words. The body as truth. Not just personal truth, but evolutionary truth. Our skin, uncovered for so long, is not a relic of an unfinished species. It is evidence of how we adapted, not with armour, but with openness. We endured not by hiding, but by integrating. We let heat in and let it out. We ran ourselves cool. We held each other for warmth. Our strength was not in layers, but in proximity. The naked body, once seen as vulnerable, was actually a site of resilience. It healed, it signalled, it endured. It bore the marks of life and continued on. Clothing, when it came, was not rejection. It was reverence, a kind of tribute to the body's limitations, an acknowledgement that while the skin was miraculous, it was not invincible. The first garments were answers to new questions. How do we carry warmth into a place where none exists? How do we move through frost, through wind, through time, and still keep the flame inside alive? And now, in a world that no longer demands survival in the same way, we find ourselves returning to older questions. What is this skin for? What is its place in a life wrapped in textiles, schedules, abstractions? How do we live in a world of screens and still remember sensation? Perhaps the skin's message is not utilitarian, but philosophical. To be human is not just to think, it is to feel, not only in metaphor but in matter. To feel cold, to feel touch, to feel seen. The skin makes us honest. It tells us when we are hurt, when we are held, when we are home, and even when we forget, it remembers. Every scar is a memory, every wrinkle a timestamp, every freckle a trace of sun. We walk around in a living history of ourselves, one that no robe or ritual can fully obscure, and maybe that's the point. The skin remains not in contrast to clothing, but beneath it, behind it, supporting it. Like the past under the present, like silence under song, like the earth beneath the road. So the return to the skin is not a stripping down, but a looking in, a kind of stillness, a kind of truth. And in that truth, we no longer need to choose between the raw and the woven, the ancient and the adorned. We are both. We always have been. And in remembering that, deeply, quietly, we begin to live again in wholeness, not divided between body and world, but connected through them, not hidden, but present. And presence, after all, is what the skin has always asked of us. Not perfection, not permanence, just attention, just breath. In a world of increasing abstraction, where life is filtered, buffered, layered in code and cloth alike, the skin invites us to return to something elemental, to remember that we are here, that we are bodies before we are ideas, that underneath every invention is a being, pulsing, warm, alive, and it is in that pulse that humanity finds its rhythm. We emerge not as minds alone, but as moving, feeling, changing creatures, interacting with the world through contact, through friction, through the intimacy of being unprotected and surviving anyway. The naked body, far from being a symbol of deficiency, was a site of dialogue, with climate, with each other, with danger, with beauty. Even now that dialogue continues, in the quiet moments, when you swim alone, when you step into the shower, when you sleep. There is no costume, no code, just skin, just you. And something in that moment feels honest, feels true. That is not regression, that is reunion. A quiet remembering that who you are does not begin with what you wear. Clothing, like language, is a tool. It empowers, it expresses, it protects, but the skin beneath it remains, always, carrying memory, signalling life, holding a conversation older than words and more intimate than history. So what then does it mean to return to the skin? It means you carry with you all the knowledge of this journey, the endurance, the invention, the shame, the ceremony, and let it settle into something softer. It means you recognize the body not as primitive, but as foundational, not as a costume, but as a home, and in that recognition, you are changed. You see others differently, not as silhouettes draped in roles, but as beings clothed in complexity, yes, but also in memory. You begin to wonder what lives beneath their layers, not voyeuristically, but compassionately. What do they carry in their skin? What stories? What scars? What echoes? And maybe, just maybe, you begin to see yourself differently too, not as separate from your skin, or burdened by it, but rooted in it, grateful for it. Knowing now that to be naked is not to be undone, it is to be complete, to be human as we once were, vulnerable, communal, enduring. So we end here not at a conclusion but at a beginning, a quiet return to something ancient, a step back into the warmth of our shared origin. You are clothed now, but beneath that, always, you are still skin, still breath, still story. And in that story something precious remains, a whisper in the wind, a flicker on the flesh, a truth you now remember. You were never truly covered, and you were never truly alone. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for walking this long road through the skin, for standing still in deep time and listening as our nakedness echoed through ice, fire, shame, and memory. If this story helped you feel a little more wonder, a little more warmth, or perhaps just a moment of quiet reflection, thank you for lending us your attention. Your presence has meant more than you know. I wonder what part of this story will remain with you. Was it a word, a gesture, a sensation you recognized in your own bones? Whether it was the image of skin darkening beneath an ancient sun, the quiet persistence of a bone needle passed hand to hand, or the haunting truth that we still dream naked, these are the threads that weave us together across time. If one of them lingers in you, feel free to share it in the comments, as a quiet offering, part of what builds this thoughtful little community. If you're still with us, and still curious, consider subscribing. There's more to uncover, more hidden layers, more forgotten paths we'll wander together. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful,